Chapter 22. Compared to breaking the high-strength plastic, the SWAT soldier's unconsciousness did not surprise Colonel Lake. How could a SWAT soldier resist a young man with such explosive power? In all his life, Colonel Lake had only seen it a handful of times. When he thought of this, Colonel Lake became even more curious and murderous toward the mechanic, Yu Feng, the disgrace of the army. The young man was already so strong, so how strong would the mechanic be? However, he did not waver in the slightest. Just like Shu Le's belief, Colonel Lake did not care about the strength of the target. He believed that no matter how strong the target was, they would still be vulnerable in the face of the powerful weapons of the federal military. Throwing his sunglasses to the ground, the colonel walked to the front of the command light screen of the temporary camp and silently watched the flashing green dots on the light screen. There were also two completely different color areas. The red and blue areas represented the possible hiding places of Target 12. However, due to the time delay in locating the target, it could only gradually spread out. As the command signals from the capital ring continued to be transmitted back, the red and blue areas on the light screen gradually shrank. Colonel Lake coldly watched this silent but thrilling process, waiting for the moment when the two areas on the light screen finally converged into a fixed point. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Colonel Lake's pupils suddenly shrank. He knew that he had made an extremely stupid mistake. The identification and location between the Eastwood region and the capital ring was a back-and-forth process. If he wanted to locate Target 1 or Target 2, it would actually take more than 8 minutes. His face was extremely gloomy, but he did not say anything to his subordinates. He just felt extremely embarrassed. He thought of the mistake the 4th Military Region made when they first came to the Eastwood region countless years ago. That mistake caused the 4th Military Region to be directly transferred from Eastwood to that primitive and backward place in the West Woods. Today, he made another mistake. Did this represent some kind of ominous sign? If there were military staff or intelligence personnel around, this kind of stupid mistake would naturally not be made. However, the problem was that Colonel Lake was a frontline combatant. In order to maintain the confidentiality of this operation, he did not follow the procedures to organize the staff headquarters. I have to hurry. Colonel Lake stared at the two color areas on the screen that were gradually approaching each other. He thought that as long as the deepest part of the two color areas overlapped, it would roughly be the rendezvous point of targets 1 and 2. Inform me as soon as you locate him. Everyone, prepare to move out. Colonel Lake handed over the work of setting up the temporary camp to the Donglin garrison troops. He notified the team members hidden in the city through the shoulder communicator. He then sat on the armored military vehicle and headed toward the depths of Hushi State City under the twilight. Shu Le scrambled down from the cart. He didn't notice the knee-deep black water in the tunnel. He found the steel ladder and desperately climbed up. He had to save all the time he had. When he reached the top, he smashed the lid open and climbed out. He skillfully raised his elbow and pushed the extremely thick electric switch up. A burst of bright light illuminated the entire room. It was the operation room of the mine where the teenager had stayed for 4 years. He opened the dust-proof door of the room, passed through, and came to the living room. He then saw a familiar person leaning on the sofa in a familiar posture. The repair shop owner, Feng Yu, seemed to have no bones. He lazily sunk into the soft sofa. The pure silver lighter in his hand had just been extinguished. The smell of kerosene seemed to be floating in the air. The cigarette in his dry lips had just been lit. The butt was bright red, but he didn't have time to release the smoke. A fugitive traitor greeted his closest employee and apprentice in this city in such a posture. Amidst the absurdity, there was a comforting sense of stability. Shu Le, whose face was covered in sweat and blood, stared at him in a daze. Looking at the miserable wound on his thigh, he didn't wait for his breath to calm down. He opened his mouth and asked, "How much time do we have?" Feng Yu raised his eyelids a little weakly. He glanced at the little guy who had accompanied him for 4 years. He smiled slightly and said, "It takes at least 8 minutes and 24 seconds for the electronic surveillance to track the location of the chip and send it back to the Bureau of Proclamation on the capital planet. After that, it will be accurately located and sent back to the execution team here. You came here by the mine cart." The speed is not bad, but the positioning system has been following you. In about 6 minutes, it will be able to find your trace through the saw pipe. Calculating this, you have about 3 minutes to talk to me. I didn't expect you to be able to escape. Feng Yu's somewhat pale face was full of pride. It seems that the trash of the Department of Defense can't compare to the things that I casually taught. I just didn't expect you to actually dare to escape and be willing to come to me. The two of them knew very well that Shula dared to escape from the control of the military, which was equivalent to putting himself on the opposite side of the Federation. For this, he would have to pay an extremely heavy price. However, Feng Yu's face still didn't show any signs of being moved. There was only calmness. 3 minutes can't be used to chat. After all, I'm not ready to hear your last words. Shula lowered his body and dug out a few green military weight belts from under the sofa. He was ready to tie Feng Yu up. I'll carry you and run. Feng Yu clearly had no interest in being a dumpling. He gently patted Shula's hand. A trace of guilt flashed through his eyes. He said, "You can't escape. I originally thought that if you didn't come, you would at most be detained for a few days. After all, the Federation government is not the barbarians of the Empire. They can't do everything so barbarically. I know you can block the electronic surveillance." Shula looked at his boss's face with some unwillingness and even anger. He said, "I haven't even tried. How do you know I can't escape?" "Because I've been escaping for more than 10 years. Feng Yu coughed twice. He smiled and took out a small tool from his bosom. He stuffed it into Shula's jacket pocket and said, "That thing you're talking about can only maintain the blocking ability for half an hour. It can't be used forever." "What happens after half an hour? Hashi province is only so big. Instead of running in vain, it's better to spend these few minutes properly." Shula's hand that was holding the military weight belt stiffened in midair. He looked at Feng Yu's haggard face and said through clenched teeth, "You can hide from the first charter for more than 10 years. Why can't you continue to hide?" Feng Yu didn't answer this most important question. He looked at the youth with a faint smile and asked, "With your personality, it seems that you forgot to ask me something." Shula lowered his head and asked, "What was the explosion on the battlefield all those years ago? Are you really a spy for the Empire?" His question was very direct. Feng Yu's answer was also very direct. The uncle blew out a smoke ring and said lazily, "Of course not." Chapter 23. What happened in the past? After a short pause, Shula no longer doubted anything. This had nothing to do with blind faith. It was just that the current tense situation did not allow him to consider more questions. Without waiting for Feng Yu's answer, he directly tied him to his body with a weight belt, then took out the small tool from his jacket pocket and pressed the switch. A light blue light was emitted from the metal tool, covering a certain area and wrapping Shula and Feng Yu's bodies. Uncle Feng Yu choked on the smoke and coughed violently. He had never thought that his little apprentice would be so stubborn. Moreover, she had such a strong sense of decisiveness and execution. He threw away the half-burned cigarette in his hand, leaned on the boy's slightly thin shoulder weakly, and muttered discontentedly, "Damn it, I don't want to run anymore, right?" Shula did not answer his words. He directly went down from the operating room's secret passage, entered the mine pit, and climbed onto the old mine cart. He believed that with the help of the strange tool with a blue light, the electronic surveillance network throughout the Federation would temporarily lose track of them. With half an hour, they could disappear further away, and it would definitely surprise the soldiers who were chasing after the boss. As if he guessed what he was thinking, Feng Yu smiled behind him and said, "After half an hour, how are you going to escape? I taught you before, this is like the connection on a circuit board. You always have to prepare the outlet of the current before you can proceed with the first step. If we are just rats on this planet, we will only gain an extra 30 minutes, which is not significant. Even if it's your last words, 30 minutes is better than 3 minutes. For some reason, perhaps Feng Yu's contemptuous attitude in the face of death angered the stubborn Shula. He lowered his head and scolded in a deep voice, "I know you haven't told me, but you must have your own way to stay in the Federation and avoid the first charter for so many years. I can only think of a way to send you to the airport, and you can think of a way to escape. What a stupid little guy. Or you underestimated the boss's fierce reputation in the Federation. Feng Yu's lips curled up slightly. I can assure you that before the Federation catches or kills me, there will not be a single aircraft in the entire Donglin district. This was a matter of course. Shula fell into silence. From the previous momentum of the special forces, he could also infer these things, but he still maintained hope in his heart and did not want to despair, even if they were really in a desperate situation now. In the dark mine, only the sound of the mine cart and the tracks rang out. I know you are very curious about how I was able to escape for so many years. In history, vicious criminals like me either hid in Bermuda, or in the recent years, they might have joined the Empire. The longest record of freedom or survival in the Federation was only 9 days. Yes, I can fake the chip behind my neck that looks like a dog leash. In the despairing silence, Feng Yu's voice was still indifferent, except for the words like chip and dog leash, which naturally revealed a strong sense of ridicule and disdain. This may be the reason why the broken computer in the Bureau of Proclamation values me so much in the program. This is also my secret. Shula's hand that was holding the front fender of the minecart suddenly tightened. He was very nervous. Feng Yu was right about what happened in the distant capital. The central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation did not hesitate to give the mechanic the first grade during the rating, but the big shots in the upper echelons of the Federation, including the old director, did not know the real reason. Strangely, the central computer seemed to be limited by some established program and did not issue this alarming warning. This was Feng Yu's secret, a big secret. In the ancient Federation, there was a proverb: if you know the knowledge or reason you want to know in the morning, then when the evening comes, even if you die, you will still have a satisfied heart. At this time, Shula had such a feeling. He had not drunk a drop of water for several hours, and under the constant intense exercise and intense fear, his lips were abnormally dry, but he knew that at this time, his mouth was dry to a large extent because he had heard his boss's biggest secret. There is nothing wrong with the first charter itself. The privacy of normal citizens has always been protected at the highest level. At least in this society, there is not so much crime. In this society where the gap between the rich and poor is widening day by day, there is not too much unfairness on the surface. In addition to the endless shock, Shula could not help but subconsciously defend the first charter, especially when he heard his boss equate the chip behind his neck with a dog leash. His heart was strongly conflicted. I have never denied this. Uncle Feng Yu's tone was indifferent. Perhaps it was because he knew that in the society of the Federation, it was difficult to find people who supported him. Even the elementary school apprentice who fled with him at this time was not willing to accept this. But the problem is that the central computer is still just a computer. It is a tool, and tools are always used by humans. If one day, someone really can completely control the cold machine in the Bureau of Proclamation, who knows what that person will do with this tool? Shula did not really understand, but he could feel that he was in an endless pit of darkness, as if he could never see the light of the way out. He felt a chill for no reason, and the place where the chip was planted on the back of his neck began to have dense goosebumps. Perhaps it was to drive away the chill in his heart. Shula asked in a hoarse voice, if that is the case, you must have a backup disguise chip. Wouldn't you be able to escape the Federation's bounty by installing it? Why don't you use it? Feng Yu's white hair wasn't very obvious in the dark, but it still gave people the feeling that he had gone through the vicissitudes of life. He touched his hair and said in a rare serious tone, because my leg is injured. I think the Federation will definitely not miss the opportunity to collect my blood sample. Aren't you an awesome mechanic? Back then, you caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people. How did you end up being targeted by the police and even injured? Shula's words were not a question, but rather to make himself feel more relaxed. Because I am old. Feng Yu's simple answer left Shula speechless, and he immediately sank into a deep self-blame. The youth knew that the federal military must have found this place and found Feng Yu through that stun baton. This is a matter of luck. It has nothing to do with you. Feng Yu knew what the youth was thinking. Although he did not know how the Bureau of Proclamation found him again, his brain was much stronger than the average person's. He easily deduced that the process must be extremely absurd and filled with countless coincidences. On the contrary, I should be the one who dragged you down, so I'll give you something. Feng Yu sighed and put something on Xu Le's wrist. He took off his watch. This watch is for me as a souvenir. Xu Le used the extremely dim light in the tunnel to clearly see the cold object on his wrist. It was a bracelet that gave off a faint metallic glow. He did not know what material it was made of. Chapter 24. What is this? The speed of the mine cart gradually slowed down in the tunnel, and the clanging sound gradually subsided, making Xu Le's trembling voice particularly obvious. The teenager's hand, which was always steady, was also trembling. He touched the smooth bracelet on his left wrist. He vaguely guessed something, but he couldn't believe it. Feng Yu didn't answer. Suddenly, the 0.7 centimeter thick metal bracelet slid like flowing mercury under the touch of Xu Le's fingers. Very thin lines appeared on the surface of the metal, and then the bracelet cracked, revealing the extremely complex and delicate structure inside. In the hollow of the bracelet, 3 thin metal wires were strung with an unknown number of shiny metal particles. It was like the starlight drawn into lines in a surreal oil painting, stringing all the dazzling stars together. Under the dim light in the mine, Xu Le's small eyes were wide open, staring at his wrist without blinking, as if he was looking at an immortal or a monster that didn't exist in this world. Those metal wires were too thin, and the vibration of the mining car was too strong. Xu Le was very worried that these metal wires would be broken at any time. Those shiny metal particles were too small, so small that they seemed to be weightless. They could be blown away by the faint wind in the mine at any time, and no one could find any trace of them. In the eyes of ordinary people, these metal wires and tiny shiny metal particles might be very delicate and fragile handicrafts, but Xu Le had studied mechanical engineering with Feng Yu for 4 years. He had a natural sensitivity to all the crystallization of human-machine civilization. At a glance, he could tell that there was something on the surface of these metal particles that the naked eye couldn't see clearly. It was the flow of lines that were as beautiful as a work of art. It was a crystal core array that was arranged and combined in a very wonderful way. Although Xu Le didn't know how these things were combined in such a small area, and how they played a role, it was very simple to associate it with the secret that Feng Yu had mentioned before. Camouflage chip. A camouflage chip that could pass all the monitoring and detection under the glory of the first charter. The back of Xu Le's neck turned cold again because he knew that there was a similar chip hidden in the depths of his neck that had accompanied him for 17 years. To be more precise, every citizen of the Federation had such a chip in their body. And for countless years, no one had ever been able to replicate such a chip, and no one had even dared to attempt to take it out, unless they decided to flee to another country and never return to the Federation for the rest of their lives. At this moment, the bracelet on the youth's wrist contained a chip that could perfectly disguise him. Xu Le could clearly control what this represented under the strong impact of his emotions. However, he only knew one thing, and that was that this chip represented a brand new life. He also remembered what his boss had said before. The person who could develop and put the camouflage chip into practice would definitely receive the Federation's highest honor, the Nebula Award. Of course, if there really was a scientist in the Federation who had developed such a thing, before he received the Nebula Award, he would definitely be sentenced to life imprisonment by the Federation government. But in any case, Xu Le was still shocked. What kind of knowledge and power was needed to contend with the Federation's most powerful civilization, the glory of the Charter? He turned his head to look at Feng Yu's somewhat tired and old face in astonishment. His mouth opened for a long time, but he couldn't say anything. He had never been so shocked in his life, except perhaps for that loud noise 12 years ago. It was also this kind of shock that made Xu Le neglect another admirable workmanship of the bracelet. The fingerprint authentication and activation were completed in an instant. This itself wasn't a particularly difficult thing to do, but for it to be completed so quickly on a metal bracelet of such thickness, it also explained many things. As I said, this is my gift to you. Feng Yu didn't seem to know what kind of uproar the bracelet he had casually thrown to Xu Le would cause if it appeared in the Federation Society. He said, "If you don't want to be locked up in prison for a few years because of me, find some time and space to take out the chip in your neck and replace it with one in the bracelet." Your identity information and the operation method are all in the hologram. You can learn it yourself. With your ability, it shouldn't be difficult. At this time, the mine car had already stopped at a certain intersection in the mine. Schuler's gently trembling fingers replaced the bracelet in its original position. He subconsciously wanted to throw the bracelet away in fear, or return it to Feng Yu. However, he found that the bracelet couldn't be thrown away. It was perfectly round, and he couldn't find any gap to open it. It was as if he had worn it since he was a child. You use it. Otherwise, you will die. You can use it. Schuler looked at Boss Feng's white hair. Only today did he know what kind of mysterious and unfathomable person his boss was. He couldn't help but stutter. I will be locked up for a few years at most. You will die. Stupid guy. I already told you the reason. Feng Yu looked at the young boy's young face expressionlessly and said, and this thing can only be used by one person. Don't ask me why. In the future, don't try to use this chip to save other people's lives. Go, change your identity, go to the capital ring, live a new life, and use another method to realize your life dreams. Another identity? Another life? Schuler was suddenly stunned. The boss's words and the real cold metal touch on his wrist reminded him that his life, which he thought was hopeless, suddenly opened another door for him. But behind that door, was it really his ideal life? And, what about the boss? I gave you a small gift and a few words of advice. Feng Yu stared at his eyes expressionlessly and said, when you go to the capital ring in the future, maybe these words will be useful to you. Schuler was still confused, but he listened subconsciously. Your eyebrows are like knives. They are too straight and too straight. This is not good. It will press down on your vision and hurt your mind. If you can change it, then change it. There is no creator among the stars, and there is no glory to worship. The most dangerous place is the safest place, but you can only believe this sentence 3 times. After today, forget about me. Forget about what happened in the past 4 years and bury it. Don't expect to find any justice or reward, and don't do boring things like revenge. I am not your father, and I don't have much kindness for you. Just be careful to stay away from the people in your life, the kind people who eat your meat but advocate vegetarianism. I know you are very curious about the explosion in the war years ago and my crime. You are willing to believe that I am innocent, but I can't say that I am innocent. But I can tell you that it won't be long before you find out what that explosion looked like. I'm done talking. Feng Yu's white hair suddenly looked dazzling in the dark mine. His real age was finally exposed. He took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a deep breath. Then, he blew it on Schuler's face and continued, time is almost up, and they will be here soon. You can get lost now. Schuler listened to him in a daze. He felt that there was a sadness that kept rising from the bottom of his heart, piercing the top of his head. He said in a hoarse voice, as if he was begging, you have to live. Of course I will live. I will live forever. Feng Yu's face suddenly showed an extremely awesome expression. He looked at the bracelet on Schuler's wrist and said, do I need you to tell me that? After saying this, the Federation's #1 traitor, Donglin's normal mechanic Feng Yu kicked Schuler, kicking the silly teenager into the saw beside the mine. Chapter 25. There wasn't a lot of sewage in the saws. It was difficult for it to form a turbulent flow, let alone an ocean. However, this section of the saws was the section with the largest drop in the saws of Hushy State. Under the impact of the sewage mixed with garbage, rotten leaves, and plastic bags, Schuler's thin body couldn't maintain its balance at all. He could only helplessly and sorrowfully follow the flow of the water. He watched as his boss, Feng Yu, quietly turned around on the other side of the water, leaving him with an indescribable back view. Sometimes it floated and sometimes it sank. The fishy water current sank Schuler to the bottom of the water, and then it carried his body out of the waves. He didn't know how long he floated and how much saliva he swallowed. Finally, he arrived at a section where the water was gradually calming down. Schuler seized this rare opportunity. His right hand reached out and grabbed a protruding rusty handle on the concrete wall. Half of his body was suspended in the sewage. After panting for a moment, the familiar trembling feeling in his body appeared again. It was transmitted to his arm. He suddenly felt hot, but his body suddenly felt light. Like a leopard cat, Shula's thin body made a beautiful turn in the air. He had already climbed out of the gradually calming water. He lay on the concrete floor, gasping for breath. The sweat and blood on his body mixed together with the sewage, soaking his entire body and emitting a foul smell. He stuck his index finger into his throat and pulled a few times, spitting out a large pool of sewage. Shula's weary spirit was a bit better. He confirmed that the cold metal bracelet on his wrist was still there, and the small device in his pocket used to block the Federation's electronic surveillance was still there. He didn't stay in the same place anymore. After looking around, he followed the nearest upstream passage and climbed up as fast as he could. Feng Yu kicked him into the sewage, and the sewage washed him here. The distance between the two was already unknown. Shula obviously understood what his boss meant. However, he was still a bit unwilling. He always felt that his boss wasn't someone who would give up on him so easily. He desperately climbed to the surface and drilled out of the manhole cover. The exit of the manhole cover happened to be on a high ground on the outskirts of Hushi region's capital. From this high ground, one could clearly see everything within a few kilometers. Shula tried his best to distinguish his surroundings, but found that it was futile. The troops searching for him should have extremely powerful concealment abilities. In the outskirts of the capital, which was 70% covered by the forest, it was extremely difficult to find traces of them with the naked eye. Shula was willing to give up. He continued to climb to the top of the big tree on the hill. Although he knew that if he stayed any longer, he was afraid that he would be tracked by the electronic surveillance system. However, if he did not see the figure of the boss with his own eyes, he would not feel at ease. The moment his feet touched the top of the tree, he saw what he wanted to see and what he didn't want to see. His gaze fell on a certain part of the forest between this place and the mine, unable to move away for a long time. His face was pale, his lips were trembling, and his eyes were filled with despair. "Boss, you said you would always be alive, but you were still lying to me. Just like all these years." The young man's eyes gradually became wet, because he knew that in the next moment, he might lose the boss uncle who was both a teacher and a friend forever. In the distant forest, he saw the figure of Uncle Feng Yu, and also saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 11 enriches in the temporary camp outside the 4th Street. The two colored blocks on the light screen overlapped with each other, and one of the colors had already been successfully condensed into a specific coordinate and turned into a light spot. The Donglin garrison officer responsible for receiving the signal from the capital planet's Bureau of Proclamation immediately transmitted the coordinates of Target 1 to all the personnel involved in the operation. After the long and meaningless conversation between the mechanic Feng Yu and Shu Le, they finally successfully exposed their tracks to the federal military. The hundreds of Special Forces elite soldiers who had been tracking the blurry colored blocks, as well as the 4th Military Region's mecha squad that specifically came from the faraway Westwoods and was fully responsible for this mission, all rushed to the valley as fast as they could. The Special Forces soldiers in camouflage were still moving stealthily in the forest, but the mechas that had secretly landed at the garrison airport from Celine's commercial spaceship were nowhere to be seen. The forest under the twilight was filled with a strange atmosphere. The Donglin garrison officers who observed the operation in the city all had suspicions in their minds, and many thoughts about Colonel Lake's command appeared in their minds. Even if Target 1 was the most vicious traitor in the history of the Federation, the target was only one person. How could he be a match for so many elite soldiers? More importantly, the Federation deployed 11 M52 standard mechas. It should be known that the entire Donglin garrison only had 40 powerful weapons of the same model. In front of a flood of metal, what kind of resistance could a weak human put up? The twilight was like blood, and the edges of the forest seemed to be burning. Feng Yu crawled out of the mine, holding his waist as he panted heavily. Only now did he realize that he really was old. He looked at the quiet surroundings, and a trace of mockery flashed through his eyes. He thought to himself that the Federation really thought highly of him. Breaking into formation? It looked like it was the same as that year. The orders these soldiers received were still to kill without mercy. Feng Yu sat on a large rock and took out a cigarette from his shirt pocket. After lighting it, He took a deep breath, and a carefree expression appeared on his face. Feng Yu didn't know who the officer leading the team this time was, and he didn't know why the other party was so careful. They didn't use the M52's terrifyingly fast chain bullets to directly blast the forest he was in into pieces. Instead, they chose to shrink the encirclement step by step. Those mechas with camouflage activated really could easily fool people's eyes when mixed together with those trees. But what were those special forces soldiers lying in the long grass waiting for? Feng Yu took a deep breath, and the cigarette between his dry lips suddenly ignited. It burned directly to the edge of the filter, and the smoke covered his face. This smoke was very strong, and it must have been very satisfying. Mechanic Feng Yu's body trembled with pleasure, and just like that, it suddenly started to tremble. That leg that seemed to have been injured earlier seemed to be infected by this trembling, and it didn't seem to be uncomfortable in the slightest. This trembling came from every muscle, joint, and even every cell in the body, and finally spread to all 4 limbs. Feng Yu's white hair draped over his back, and the tattered jacket on his body made a whoosh sound. His legs were slightly apart, and the trembling was so exaggerated that it seemed as if the air had started to buzz. The mechanic's legs trembled like a bowstring. Both of his hands trembled like an arrow ready to explode at any moment. The buzzing sound in the air became denser and denser, and finally turned into the sound of a muffled explosion. At some unknown time, the rock on Feng Yu's body was in his hand. Then, it turned into a cannonball and directly smashed into the depths of the dense forest. With a crack, the strange sound of metal breaking rang out. His slightly thick legs trembled as he disappeared from where he stood. In the next moment, he flew over the long grass and circled behind a tree while trembling. With a speed that was absolutely impossible for humans to react to, he viciously punched out with a single fist. The exposed hydraulic pipe of an M52's left leg was smashed apart by this bare fist. Engine oil sprayed out like a cloth bursting out, and the huge metal mecha suddenly lost its balance and slowly fell down. Chapter 26. In different people's eyes, the same image represented completely different meanings. Behind a tall tree surrounded by the valley, an M52 painted in a matte light was like a dozing tiger. It was quiet, squatting sideways in an ugly but practical position. This was the federal military's single soldier mech with the thickest armor and the most powerful firepower. Its 2 alloy mechanical legs were jokingly called frog legs by the soldiers. Just above the frog legs, Colonel Lake sat in the control cabin, vigilantly looking ahead. With 1.4 kilometers as the base distance, the 4th Military Region's special mech team members were scattered around the valley. Colonel Lake was their leader, so he was naturally confident that his B4 commando team could maintain perfect unity and coordination. Those team members were like his fingers, able to maintain accuracy even under high hand speed. The mid-range weapon system had already been fully charged during the pursuit. The moment they received the specific location of Target 1, the entire pursuit formation turned and directly sealed off the small valley. However, Colonel Lake did not give the order to launch a blanket fire. Although no carbon-based life should be able to survive the chain attack of 11 M52s, Colonel Lake did not dare to take the risk before he saw the target. GAO Minute extended her head and transmitted the scene in the valley back. Colonel Lake saw the tired face of the white-haired mechanic and the wound on his thigh. He breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. A former soldier who was unarmed should not be as dangerous as before. However, for some reason, Colonel Lake still did not give the order to attack. This was because he kept having a very strange feeling. If they attacked at this distance, the target might really be able to take advantage of the chaos to escape. Although this was something that did not make sense logically, more than 10 years ago, that frustrated mechanic in the valley seemed to have defied logic and survived the furious pursuit of the Department of Defense. And he had survived, for more than 10 years. The small screen in the mecha's control cabin clearly displayed the scene in the valley. That white-haired mechanic did not seem to notice anything. He lit a cigarette. He was not in a hurry to escape, so why did he light a cigarette? Did he look at me? The deformed sunglasses on the bridge of Colonel Lake's nose trembled. Looking at the cold eyes staring straight at him on the hologram, he wondered if the mechanic was looking at him. Could it be that the other party had discovered his existence from such a distance? Colonel Lake, who was extremely confident in his concealment skills, felt a chill in his heart. He began to lose his confidence. Especially when he noticed that the mechanic had started to tremble wretchedly, a strong sense of uneasiness took over his entire body. He did not want to wait any longer, so he immediately ordered the 10 members of the team to attack from afar. However, the mechanic on the screen seemed to be able to accurately calculate the mentality of the Federation's special mecha team. Just 0.01 seconds before the long-range attack command was completely converted into a radio signal, "Mechanic Feng, you move." His movement shook the world. The half-ton rock was hurled out by the mechanic's arms. It whistled like a cannonball and smashed into an M52 that had been carefully hiding at the 11 o'clock position. The heavy armor outside the M52's control cabin was heavily smashed. Stone fragments flew everywhere. Although it was not seriously deformed, this powerful impact still shook the mecha team members in the control cabin, who were connected to the electric induction chair, until they spat out blood. They would not be able to recover in a short period of time. The half-ton rock in the mechanic's hands was actually thrown out like a grenade. How much strength did this require? Was this mechanic still human? Colonel Lake's face was full of shock as he calculated the incredible strength the mechanic had displayed in that moment. His lips felt bitter. Immediately after, his gaze followed the mechanic who had already become a shadow. He slid past a patch of long grass in the valley and rushed behind a large tree. "Old 7. Colonel Lake shouted harshly through the communicator. He wanted to warn the team members hiding behind the tree, but it was all too late. He could only watch as the mechanic's fist smashed into the hydraulic pipe behind the M52's thick and heavy knees. Colonel Lake knew that the M52's relatively weak defense was at the joint behind the knees. However, he had never thought that a bare-handed person would be able to break that hydraulic pipe made of alloy steel with just his own fists. The flying rock from before had displayed the unparalleled strength of the mechanic, and the trembling of the legs in the next moment had displayed the terrifying speed of the mechanic, Feng Yu. As for the fist that had forcefully broken the hydraulic tube of the M52, it was as if he had demonstrated the strength of his body to these Federation soldiers. In just an instant, the mecha team that had not been able to attack in time lost 2 mechas. One of the M52s had been hit by the rock, injuring the team members in the control cabin. As if drunk, the mecha was trying its best to maintain its balance so that it would not fall off the hill. Meanwhile, the mecha that had faced Feng Yu's attack directly behind the tree had already fallen backward, looking extremely miserable. The mecha that was shot towards the sky was illuminated by the twilight into a frightening pool of blood. On the other side of the curtain of blood, in front of the gigantic mecha, there was a figure that seemed incomparably small, yet seemed exceptionally powerful. At this moment, the special mecha team members and the Donglin Garrison Special Forces in the valley were all stunned. The white-haired mechanic did not seem like a person. At least, he was not a normal person. In this world, no normal person dared to confront a mecha head-on. However, Feng Yu had proven that in the face of powerful individual strength, the metal mecha of the mechanical civilization was not an existence that could not be resisted. The special mecha team of the 4th Military Region of the Westwoods led by Colonel Lake had been recommended by the Bureau of Proclamation to be in charge of this assassination mission. They had also received the approval of the Ministry of Defense and the Special Task Force. This was because in the war with the Empire a few years ago, the 4th Military Region's powerful combat strength had received the respect and trust of the entire Federation. However, in the face of this sudden change today, the usually cold and determined Colonel Lake still felt a wave of shock in his heart. This was because he realized that the strength displayed by the target of this operation was something he had never seen on the battlefield before. It was also something he had never learned in the 2nd Military Academy. However, the strong nerves of the Federation soldiers caused the entire formation in the valley to only pause for a moment. The mecha that were still in good condition and the heavy firepower deployment were instantly activated. Mid-range weapons began to discharge energy and metal bullets in the direction of the tree. Even if there were still their own comrades there, they had to react immediately and kill that traitorous mechanic. The shrapnel easily shredded the tree into countless pieces that flew in the air. The frightening sound of gunfire in the valley covered up the existence of everything. In just an instant, countless bullets bombarded the back of the tree. Can Old 7 hold on? Colonel Lake led 5M52s along the path in the valley and rushed over there as fast as he could. There were no loopholes in the entire encirclement. He was worried for his team members in his heart. However, in the next moment, his eyes narrowed slightly. With a heavy heart, he pressed the button beside him with determination. From this moment on, the function of the enemy identification system disappeared. Unlimited attacks began. The mecha that had its hydraulic pipes blown apart also became the target of countless firepower attack. This was because he realized that the mechanic's ghostly figure had already climbed to the abdomen of the crippled mecha. Using some unknown method, he actually easily removed the mecha's protective shield and was about to open the operating cabin. Chapter 27. Feng Yu broke the hydraulic pipe with one punch, and the mecha behind the tree fell backward. Meanwhile, he used his fastest speed to crawl to the belly of the mecha. His hands were still trembling as he stroked the surface of the large and cold mecha, but his movements were abnormally gentle. It was as if he was a nervous, trembling virgin boy caressing the woman he loved the most, except that this woman's body was a little too big. This scene was very strange. The toppled M52 mecha kept bouncing back and forth as the mechanic Feng Yu stroked it with his trembling hands. The mechanical arms extended and contracted rapidly, and with the hiss of the motor, the mecha twisted and turned on the ground. It seemed particularly restless and awkward, as if it was ticklish, but also as if it was trying to please Feng Yu charmingly. It was also this M52's bouncing and twisting movements that had successfully helped Feng Yu block several long-range sniper bullets. Compared to the movements of the mecha below him, Feng Yu's expression was unusually solemn. He continued to seriously move his hands, and in the shortest amount of time possible, he had removed all of the external defensive functions of this mecha. This was very strange. In Feng Yu's hands, the military standard mecha seemed to have become a dull toy, or perhaps it was more like a puppet. The mecha's movements, which could only be controlled by the computer in the cockpit, appeared as Feng Yu touched the mechanical joints at the back of the mecha. Feng Yu's hands seemed to have some kind of magic. Feng Yu was as familiar with this mecha as if it was his own body. In just 1 second, he had removed all of the mecha's resistance and successfully opened the cockpit at the belly of the mecha, revealing the shocked face of the still young 4th Military Region's mecha warrior inside. Stop him. Colonel Lake did not give this order. He watched the scene in shock, knowing that he had to make an effective response in the shortest amount of time possible. Based on the Federation's preparations, even if the mechanic was able to knock down 1 or 2 mecha, he would still not be able to leave the valley alive. However, once he really managed to snatch a mecha, who knew what would happen after that? Even though he was in a state of shock, Colonel Lake was still extremely impressed by the scenes on the screen. Earlier, the power that the mechanic Feng Yu had displayed was too inhuman, so other than shock, Colonel Lake had no other thoughts. However, at this time, the mechanic was like a chef, controlling a mecha through the external mechanical joints of the mecha. This kind of ability really made him feel incomparable admiration. As expected of a mechanic teacher from our secondary hospital. Colonel Lake thought back to the time when he had first entered the 2nd Military Academy more than 10 years ago. That middle-aged teacher had stood at the mecha control desk every day, caressing every inch of the mecha's skin as if it was his lover. At the time, his batch of classmates had all thought that this teacher was crazy, but only today did he know that this teacher's craziness was reflected in his strength. The power of the high-energy compression energy cabin was raised to the highest level in an instant. The thick mechanical legs of the M52 slammed violently against the ground of the valley, causing the heavy body of the mecha to fly into the air. After gaining a good view, Colonel Lake, who had flown out from the front, no longer hesitated. The chain magazine mounted on his right arm instantly shot out flames, shooting towards the mecha that was bouncing non-stop behind the tree. Sorry, Old 7, he said to himself. This was because he knew that under such intense firepower, the mechanic Yu Feng would definitely die, and the team members in the control cabin would definitely not survive. With a snap, Feng Yu turned his wrist and crushed the wrist of the soldier in the mecha. He slapped away the defensive stiletto that the soldier always carried with him. Then, he chopped at the soldier's neck with his palm, knocking him unconscious. Immediately after that, he burrowed into the mecha like a loach. The M52 that Lake was in was still in midair. The screen clearly displayed the mechanic's actions. He was not worried, because he knew that the M52's cabin door would definitely not close in time. However, his eyes immediately narrowed again, because he found that he had once again underestimated the opponent's methods. As the mechanic burrowed into the cabin door, his left hand hung behind him and seemingly very casually slapped the side of the alloy cabin door. With this slap, the cabin door of the mecha immediately reacted and closed tightly. The fierce bullet fire instantly hit the M52 on the ground, creating countless sparks. The alloy surface was damaged, but it did not penetrate. An M52 swooped down from the valley, and the M52 on the ground suddenly bounced up from the ground. In an instant, the two mechas collided violently. The distance between the two was too close, so Colonel Lake had no choice but to give up on the idea of attacking from a distance. He bravely ejected the sharp particle blade on his mecha's wrist, turned his body halfway in the air, and viciously stabbed into the opponent's mecha's abdomen. The sound of armor being pierced rang out. The M52 that had just bounced up from the ground had most of its mobility disabled by the mechanic, so it actually could not dodge this stab. The armor on its abdomen was pierced, and sparks flew everywhere. Colonel Lake did not feel the slightest bit of joy in his heart. He did not understand how the opponent could be in a single operator cabin with Old 7, and he did not think that this stab of his would be able to disable the opponent's mobility. Right at this moment, he found that the opponent's two heavy mechanical arms had silently rested on his shoulders. Then, the two mechanical arms began to tremble. Colonel Lake felt that his mecha had also begun to tremble. Recalling how the mechanic Feng Yu had attacked fiercely like a fierce tiger in the valley earlier, Colonel Lake was extremely vigilant. He let out a shout in the control cabin, and his hand speed instantly increased to the maximum. His empty hands were firing at full power. He had taken the absolute risk of using a heavy weapon at close range, unwilling to let the opponent go. However, Colonel Lake's movements were still too slow. Just as his fingers were rapidly pressing the buttons, that intense and unbearable tremor had already spread to his mecha. In an instant, the central control system of the mecha was in chaos, and he was temporarily out of control. The sound of wind whistling rang out. The M52 that the mechanic Feng Yu had snatched shook its arms. The mecha's own mobility followed this extremely simple action, and a huge burst of power erupted, directly throwing the M52 that Colonel Lake was in into the air. Only then did the M52, which had been thrown away, reactivate its heavy weapon. 3 extremely beautiful bullets shot out endlessly. However, the mech itself was spinning in circles in the air, so these bullets were all fired into the air. On the ground, popping sounds rang out incessantly as rocks and trees were smashed into smithereens. The M52 mecha, with its 3 trails of fire trailing behind it, did not hit its target. Instead, the pursuing mecha team and special forces were so suppressed that they did not dare to raise their head. In the air, Colonel Lake desperately tried to regain control of the mecha, only hoping that he would not become a special mecha officer who was humiliated and thrown to his death. His body was cold, and his heart was filled with a sense of defeat. On one hand, he was shocked by the opponent's tyrannical mecha operating ability, and on the other hand, he was cursing the Bureau of Proclamation's intelligence. Only now did he know what kind of terrifying existence the target of the first-level sequence was. Colonel Lake's confidence was shattered in this one face-to-face encounter. Meanwhile, those Special Forces members of the 4th Military Region also felt that the opponent was difficult to defeat. If that traitorous mechanic had not managed to get his hands on the mecha, they would still have had the confidence to kill the opponent, but the opponent had already successfully gotten his hands on a mecha. Could they still kill the opponent? Amidst the rain of bullets that filled the sky, the M52 mecha's body trembled as it moved quickly in a ridiculous posture. It was not hit at all. The black standard style of the mech gave it a heavy feeling. However, the rapid movement of the M52 in the midst of a hail of bullets made the M52 look demonic. The firepower in the valley gradually calmed down, because the ambushers found that they could not hit that demonic mecha at all. They stared blankly at the black mecha leaping about halfway up the mountain as if they were looking at a monster. They knew that this demonic feeling was not because the M52 itself had any advanced technology content, but because of the person inside the mecha's cockpit. The Federation's operation to hunt down and kill the mechanic was once again launched after more than 10 years. Could it be that what awaited the Federation was another shameful failure? The sky gradually darkened, and hazy stars floated in the night sky at the edge of the Donglin region. It seemed that the starry sky above the Federation civilization did not want to see this happen, so one of the stars strangely lit up. In the blood-red twilight, an area in the originally starless sky suddenly lit up. A beam of light filled with destructive energy shot out from that area, instantly tearing apart the dust-filled atmosphere above the Donglin region. It tore through space and struck the ground, hitting the black mecha leaping like a monster. This beam of light was powerful and merciless, completely ignoring the trembling dance steps of the M52. In its eyes, this mecha attempting to break through was just a clown. Chapter 28. The siege in the valley had begun. Boss Feng Yu, smoking a cigarette in his mouth, had shuddered and transformed into a prehistoric monster to throw rocks and attack. Then, he had transformed into a charming mechanic to get close to the mecha and successfully neutralize the defensive capabilities of an M52. Then, he had seized control of the mecha and violently shaken the ace mecha of the Federation Special Forces team into a flustered firebird with a fiery tail in the air. Finally, he had transformed into a demonic black shadow amidst the shrapnel that filled the sky. One scene after another fell into the eyes of Shu Le. He had been standing at the top of a large tree on that hill in the distance, his hands tightly gripping the branches beside him to maintain his balance. He watched everything unfold in the distance with incomparable emotion. Although he was far away, he still felt shaken to his core. His body had been trembling non-stop, causing the birds on the tree to fly away one after another into the twilight. Of course, this was not a strange ability he had learned to call himself uncle, it was an instinctive fear and agitation. He had thought that Uncle Boss would be killed by the military in an instant. He had even thought that Uncle Boss had grown tired of his life as a fugitive and had chosen a quick method to end his own life. However, he had not expected that the following development of the plot would be so sudden and unexpected. Apart from making him sweat profusely, he was so nervous that he wanted to vomit. In particular, the powerful strength that had erupted from the boss's trembling legs and trembling body, as well as his valiant performance after he had burrowed into the mecha at the end, it was as if he had given Shu Le, who had been watching the battle from afar, an opportunity to learn, opening a completely different window. In this world, probably only Shu Le knew what those tremors were about. The youth stared in shock at the valley, thinking to himself that the boss had not practiced or performed in these 4 years. He was probably too lazy to practice, but even so, he was still strong enough to fight head-on with the mecha. What kind of absurd life and person was this? Whether it was in novels or movies, Shu Le had never seen such a powerful figure. When he thought of how this figure had been by his side for 4 years, he suddenly felt at a loss. He vaguely felt that the things his boss had taught him might lead him to a completely different path in life. However, Shu Le still couldn't imagine himself becoming an inhuman like the boss in the future. That was too inconceivable. The window was open, but the grassland outside was still vast and boundless. The road was in front of him, but he didn't know where it ended. The youth just stared blankly at the movement and silence. He didn't have any ambition, and he didn't even have the extravagant hope of becoming such a strong person. This was because he knew that his current ability was at least a few dozen light years away from the realm displayed by the boss in the valley. But no matter what, Shu Le watched as the black mecha the boss was in was about to break out of the encirclement and escape the encirclement of the federal military. His mood was incredibly relaxed and happy. The base of his thigh no longer twitched. He prepared to sneak down the tree and find a quiet place to carry out the mission his boss had given him. He would hide under the watchful eyes of the Federation and never come out again. Just as everything was developing in a good direction, he reflexively turned his head and saw that beam of light. That beam of light that had shot straight down from the grayish-red sky, smashing viciously into the valley. At this time, it was already late in the evening. Half of the night sky was already black and grey. Occasionally, a few small stars would flash with a hazy light. However, in the night sky above the valley, there was not a single trace of a star. It was only a stretch of emptiness. And in this emptiness, suddenly and silently, without warning, a beam of light descended. Shula watched this scene with wide eyes and slack jaws. His feet slipped and he almost fell off the tree. He could only hold on to the tree branch with all his might. However, the loud noise and explosion that followed shook the entire Hashi region's verdant mountains and fields. Naturally, he was shaken down from the tree as well. The beam of light that was about 1 meter in diameter was extremely pure white. However, it did not have the holy aura described in religious books. Instead, it was full of a destructive and powerful aura. Just like that, in a situation where no one in the valley had expected it, it directly struck the black M52 mecha that was fleeing halfway up the mountain. That black mecha, which had appeared to be at ease despite being besieged, was like a pitiful and lowly insect under this beam of light. It couldn't make any evasive movements at all and faced it head-on. The super alloy armor was instantly torn apart under the white beam of light. Countless circuit chip components were destroyed by the tremendous energy like fish scales and shot in all directions. No one could survive this kind of attack that came from outer space. However, the power of the beam of light still did not end there. When it entered the Earth's crust, it triggered a violent explosion. Within a 500-meter radius of the black mecha, the entire ground was as fragile as the surface of a baked biscuit. It cracked open, trembled, twisted, and rippled in all directions. After a loud boom, the Donglin garrison special forces in the bushes near the mountainside were shaken high into the air. Most of them were shaken to death. Meanwhile, the 4th Military Region's special mecha team that was slightly further away also could not withstand such a powerful force. They all fell to the ground one after another. Amidst the powerful turbulence of the electromagnetic waves, they were momentarily unable to move. The birds and beasts that roamed freely in the valley cried out in agony. Who knew how many trees collapsed? Further away on the hill, the branch in Shula's hand was also snapped in half. His body was like a kite with a broken string, falling heavily into the ground. It took him a long, long time before he managed to get up. He stared dumbfoundedly at the valley. Although he could not see anything else, he seemed to have seen his boss's tragic death. He no longer had any hope of surviving, because under the attack of the most advanced weapons of the Federation civilization, who could still survive? At this moment, Shula understood some things. At least, he understood what his boss had said earlier in the mine. You want to know what the explosion was all about? Perhaps you'll be able to see it in a moment. Yes, Shula had seen the beam of light, had seen the explosion. That was why he understood. The explosion in the armory more than 10 years ago was most likely a similar scene. However, the armory back then was full of ammunition, which was why the scale of the explosion was so much larger. As expected, his boss had been wronged. This knowledge might have made Shula's pitiful sense of justice feel a little better, but it could not erase the incomparably heavy expression of pain on his face. He rubbed his eyes. Taking advantage of the fact that the army in the valley was also in a state of panic, he forced his tired body to run down the hill into the darkness. The energy of the device had been charged again. The youth pressed the button, letting the faint blue light envelop him. Then, he began to flee. He told himself that he had to live. He had to live well. He had to live for his boss and his own share. When the youth Shula embarked on his journey of escape, in space 600 kilometers away from the surface of the Donglin region, the very beautiful Westwoods commercial spaceship that glowed with a silver light all over began to adjust its posture again. Attack complete. The captain of the spaceship looked at the small black dot after the explosion on the screen. After a moment of silence, he said, "Return to 1,200 kilometers orbit." Chapter 29. The Ancient Bell was the largest spaceship owned by the Ancient Bell Company. Its endurance was one of the top 10 in the entire Federation. The Ancient Bell Company was the largest company in the Westwoods region of the Federation. Its business covered many industries, and its capital was extremely strong. However, Even after hundreds of years of investigation by the Westwoods Region Management Committee using the Company Information Disclosure Act, they still couldn't find out who was behind this giant company. Many people guessed that other than the Federation's Asset Management Committee, there were also the shadows of the most powerful families in the Westwoods region behind this company. Some people even faintly guessed that the ancient Bell Company might be related to the 4th Military Region, which had been stationed in the Westwoods region for countless years. This time, in order to cooperate with the Federation's plan, the ancient Bell Company sent this spaceship to the Eastwoods region to bring greetings and officials from the Westwoods region. They started a series of government and civilian exchanges. On the surface, these activities were just to cover the actions of the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team. However, no one expected that the real fatal blow to the traitorous mechanic was actually this spaceship itself. It was just a commercial spaceship. How could it carry a space weapon that was strictly controlled by the military? The captain of the ancient Bell spaceship was a big fat man. After confirming the effects of the vertical cannon through the thermal sensor and the Eastwoods satellite imaging system, he relaxed and leaned against the sofa, panting. He took the cup of coffee from his secretary, which was still warm, and drank a few mouthfuls without tasting the taste. When Colonel Lake comes back, he will be very angry. The secretary reminded the captain in a low voice. According to the usual configuration, the captain was usually accompanied by an officer. However, this fat man obviously didn't have the self-awareness of a company. He treated himself as some kind of officer, because in reality, he was originally an officer. The fat captain's face was very gentle, but the occasional flash of coldness in his squinted eyes showed his true personality. He said softly, "If Lake can complete this mission, of course I won't take the risk of using the main cannon." The fat captain's brows, which were covered by the wrinkles, flashed with a hint of gloominess. He gritted his teeth and said painfully, "One cannon destroyed half a year's energy quota of the company. Do you think I don't feel bad? That brat Lake is such a fucking disappointment. How much does the military spend on their special mecha team every year? There's nothing we can do about it. The orders from the capital are absolute. The President's Office, the Bureau of Proclamation, and the Ministry of National Defense are all pressuring the commander. We can't waste these resources anymore." The secretary shrugged and said, "It's good that the problem is solved. I have to go quickly. I still have to report and explain to the Eastern Woods District Office and the Administrative Committee. I also have to pass on the Federation's order to them. Otherwise, not only will the exchange visit between Eastern Woods and the Westwoods be ruined, but the Eastern Woods garrison warships will also fly into the sky and surround us in anger. Give them 4 guts." The fat captain's eyes flashed with a hint of mockery. "Eastwood has been decadent for too long. Just hand over the Federation's secret order to the sector office. I don't think these officials will dare to do anything to our 4th military region. Speaking of which, the military region lost all its face on this stupid planet back then. Today, we've finally gotten some back." The secretary shrugged again. He was a civilian officer who had joined the ancient clock company after retirement. Unlike the captain and the others, he still secretly maintained his military status in the 4th military region. Therefore, he did not understand, nor did he want to understand, why his comrades in the 4th military region always had such a strong sense of disgust towards the Eastern Woods district. The West Woods and Eastern Woods were clearly on opposite ends of the Federation. They were extremely far apart, and it was rare for them to even cross paths once in a few years. The captain's room returned to silence. The fat captain carefully put the cold coffee beside him, turned on the secret circuit, and faced the motionless portrait on the screen. He was extremely respectful, and even a little flattering, as he lowered his head and said, "Boss, we succeeded." The portrait was of a middle-aged man, wearing a well-ironed dark-colored military uniform. The gold stars and silver bars on his shoulders clearly showed this soldier's shocking military rank. The communication between Dong Lin and Siling would take at least 14 minutes. That was why the middle-aged general's portrait remained motionless like a puppet. However, his deeply furrowed brows and cold eyes still gave off an endless amount of pressure. The fat captain swallowed a mouthful of saliva and continued, "Just to kill the mechanic, we spent half a year's energy quota. But this was a mission issued by the Federation. Do you think you should send a letter to the President's office to let the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy coordinate and give the company a little compensation? He suddenly thought of a problem. Taking advantage of the time before the portrait on the screen moved, he said shyly, "Also, the young miss still refuses to eat today." After saying this, the fat captain, who had fired the main cannon while talking and laughing, turned the mecha into ashes, and destroyed countless green spaces in the suburbs of Eastwood, shrunk and turned off the communicator. Then, he ran out of the captain's room with his butt raised. Shula had also not eaten today. Under the cover of the explosion, he ran down from the hill. Taking advantage of the chaos in the suburbs of Hushy State, he successfully entered the underground waterway once again. He ran as fast as he could and finally ran into a forest where there were few people. His butt fell into a thick layer of fallen leaves, shaking up a stale smell. The youth panted rapidly. He felt his body was abnormally tired and hungry. His heart was also very tired because of sadness. No matter who it was, after experiencing what had happened today, their spirit would be greatly impacted. Moreover, he was not even 18 years old yet. At this time, it was already late at night. Suddenly, there was a pitter-patter sound in the sky above the forest. Rain fell for no reason, shaking up the dust on the ground covered by fallen leaves, causing the entire forest to be filled with the smell of dust. Shula, with his face covered in dust, his eyes were full of sadness. He closed his eyes, bit his lip hard, and took a deep breath. He looked at the signal jammer in his hand and found that the blue light was getting fainter and fainter. It would lose its effect in at most 2 minutes. Let's begin. Shula stared blankly at the metal bracelet on his wrist. Using the pad of his finger, he gently touched it, revealing the metal wires and those tiny chips inside. He felt his heartbeat become stronger and stronger, but his body was getting weaker and weaker. The piercing pain at the back of his neck spread from the bone to the rest of his body. It was extremely cold. A new life was waiting for him. Chapter 30. The raindrops became heavier and heavier, more and more urgent, hitting the big leaf autumn forest on the outskirts of Hushy region. The pitter-patter was like the sound of war drums on an ancient battlefield, beating an exciting rhythm, urging people to bravely move forward, forward, and forward. In the already soaked autumn forest, the rain soaked all the withered leaves of the trees, and also soaked Shula's body. Staring at the little star-like chip in the bracelet, the young man's heart was filled with complicated emotions. Once he switched to a brand new chip, it represented a completely unknown future, a completely new life, completely cut off from the past, no friends, no family. Of course, he didn't have any family before, and he didn't have many friends, but the coffee in Hushy region, the beer in Hushy region, the clock tower street in Hushy region, the girls in Hushy region, the operation room in the mine, the repair shop in Xianglan Avenue, the library in the State University, and this unchanging dusky sky. All of these memories, was he going to say goodbye like this? Shula's fingers trembled incessantly. He knew that once he pierced the hair-thin metal wire into his neck, everything would change. Maybe it would be good, maybe it would be extremely bad, who knew? Facing the most difficult and easiest choice in life, Shula, with a calmness that didn't match his age, used only a dozen seconds to make up his mind, because the gradually dimming blue light in the rain reminded him that the electronic surveillance of the Federation would find him soon. If he wanted to live freely, then he must no longer be Shula. Fiercely wiping away the raindrops on his face, revealing clean skin under the dust, Shula muttered a few words in a low voice, and the emotions in his eyes became calmer and calmer. His hands no longer trembled, and with unusual stability, he pulled out the metal wire from the bracelet, aimed it at the back of his neck, and slowly pierced it. As for how to exchange for a chip, the weak light screen that had popped up on the bracelet had already taught Shula. However, the young man's current actions were, after all, exceptionally frightening and absurd in his knowledge. He had never even heard of someone being able to forge a human chip to avoid the radiance of the first charter. He didn't have much confidence. His hands still didn't tremble, but they appeared exceptionally slow. This was what the mechanic Feng Yu admired the most about him. He had a natural control over the metal mechanical chip, and more importantly, no matter what kind of dangerous situation he was in, this young man could always maintain his calm, even if it was only on the surface. In order to exchange for the chip in his body without the help of the relevant equipment, one must have the most stable hands and the most stable heart in the world. Coincidentally, Schuler had both of these. Even though he was so tired that he could fall asleep at any time, hungry to the point that his eyes were somewhat unfocused, and sad to the point that the rims of his eyes were still red under the washing of the rain, his hands were still stable. Perhaps it was precisely because Feng Yu believed in this young man's ability that he would hand over such a precious legacy to him. The extremely thin metal wire steadily stopped at a distance of 0.5 millimeters from the skin. The rain in the autumn forest very tactfully brushed past the metal wire and left, not interfering. This was a job that no one knew about, but was enough to shock the entire Federation. Right at this moment, something strange happened. The sharp tip of the metal wire, which had not trembled in the slightest, suddenly trembled as if it had smelled some kind of extremely sweet and blissful paradise. The tip of the metal wire rapidly trembled and vibrated within an extremely small range, faster and faster. It was so fast that it could not be seen with the naked eye, so fast that the wind and rain could not hit it at all. It seemed to have sensed something and continuously searched, using the tiny electric charge attached to it as a source of energy to search continuously. It searched on the exposed skin of Schuler's neck. A layer of small goosebumps appeared on the back of Schuler's neck. Because he was nervous, he allowed the rain to wash over him, but he did not dare to move at all. After who knew how long, only a light beep was heard. The tip of the metal wire that had been rapidly trembling suddenly entered a state of absolute stillness. The metal wire maintained its strange curved state, its tip aimed at the skin on the back of Schuler's neck. In this stillness amidst the wind and rain, a weak blue electric current began to accumulate, like an extremely sharp sword waiting to be unsheathed. A bolt of lightning illuminated the dark sky of the outskirts amidst the wind and rain. With a crack, the sound of thunder rumbled through the entire world. Like a light snake, the lightning carved a demonic mark in the air, and also slightly brightened the autumn forest. In this instant of light, the figure of the youth kneeling in the rain suddenly froze. With a whoosh, the metal wire automatically extended by 3 centimeters and easily pierced into the back of Schuler's neck. Then, the metal wire began to tremble with all its might, like a sword that was trying to break through the defense of armor. It was also like a lightning-striking venomous snake that was biting its prey, continuously injecting venom, wanting to give its target the final fatal blow. At this moment, if someone was present, they would definitely notice that the figure of the youth kneeling in the rain began to tremble in pain after stiffening. They would also notice that the skin on the back of the youth's neck seemed to have become transparent, and that the faint blue electric current was constantly swimming and struggling around his neck. In the autumn forest amidst the wind and rain, there was suddenly a slightly burnt smell. Schuler's small eyes were painfully wide open, and his face looked abnormally terrifying. He felt that his body was burning incomparably, and the pain coming from the back of his neck was even more painful. However, that weak electric current was continuously flowing from the metal wire into his body, directly connecting to his nervous system, allowing him to clearly endure this unbearable torture. Let's end this quickly, it doesn't matter even if we fail. The youth Schuler, who had always been as sincere and firm as a rock, finally couldn't endure it anymore. He felt that the blood in his body seemed to be boiling, and his mouth and tongue were incomparably dry. His entire body was in pain as if he was struck by lightning. Just as he was about to give up, there seemed to be some kind of sound coming from the back of his neck. It was like the sound of the circuit chip that he was most familiar with, and also like the sound of a sword being sheathed again. The storm hit the autumn forest, soaking the sky and earth. Schuler's thin figure trembled in pain, his fingers powerlessly left the metal wire, and his whole body knelt in the forest in the rain. An indescribable pain and feeling made his body bow, and then he looked up and painfully screamed at the rainstorm falling from the sky. The rain fell on his face, and it was incomparably painful, sliding down his body. He knelt in the rain, but still felt pain and burning all over his body. In his heart, he was somewhat at a loss as he prayed to the black sky, let the storm come more violently. Then, his mind went blank, and he powerlessly turned over, falling into the rain and dirty leaves all over the ground. Chapter 31. When Shula woke up, the rain had already stopped. The thick, dark clouds had also left this part of the night sky, revealing the few lonely stars above. There weren't many stars that could be seen in the Donglin district's night sky. Shula lay on the ground, squinting his eyes to distinguish which star was which. Just like a common sentence in novels, of course, he didn't know how much time had passed. His wristwatch had been replaced by a bracelet, and under the intense pain and mental shock, time seemed particularly blurry to him at this time. Lying on the wet ground was not comfortable. Although the fallen leaves were very soft due to the rain, like a quilt on a bed, the smell was very unpleasant. However, Shula didn't get up because he was tired, hungry, and weak. A sense of fatigue seeped out from his bones to his muscles through the pores on his skin, making him not want to move at all. Just like that, he lay quietly in the autumn forest after the rain. He opened his eyes and looked at the unclear starry sky above his head. It was not until a very long time later that he struggled to prop himself up and let out a long sigh. The content of this sigh was so rich that even at such a young age, he began to have a taste of the vicissitudes of life. The glowing blue jammer had long since stopped working. However, Shula lay in the wet forest for so long, and still, no Federation army or police came to find him. This fact confirmed one thing for Shula, and his mood was very complicated. Glancing at the metal bracelet on his left wrist that had returned to normal, Shula was silent for a moment. He touched the back of his neck and felt a small wound. He felt a slight pain and knew that the chip in his body had been replaced with the one made by the boss himself, successfully hiding from the electronic surveillance. From this moment on, Shula was no longer Shula. He stood up with the help of a tree trunk and carefully sucked the drop of blood between his fingers into his mouth. Swaying his weak body, he walked out of the forest under the cover of the night. As he walked with difficulty, he pulled out the information on the bracelet, hoping to familiarize himself with his new identity as soon as possible. Otherwise, he could be exposed at any time. A new chip and a new identity appeared on the screen. It was still the simple, sincere, and inexperienced face. It was still the Donglin district's resident card number, but it had a completely different life path. This identity came from the capital. At this time, he should have just graduated from high school, completed his military service, and was in a state of semi-unemployment. There was nothing special about him that could attract the attention of the authorities. And the name of this identity was Shula, or Shula. He didn't know if it was because of the chip change that caused some deviation in Shula's spirit, or because the previous rainstorm washed away the layer of dullness that hid his personality, or because of Uncle Feng's death, he decided to live a better life. In short, Shula, who was walking down the mountain, looked at the ID on the screen. He screamed in a way that didn't match his personality, and then fell heavily to the ground. Uncle Feng, you clearly prepared this identity for me, but you didn't tell me it would hurt so much. Besides, why are you still calling yourself Shula? You're really not worried that I'll be captured by the army. Apart from the boss, I'm probably the first fugitive in history to escape from electronic surveillance. This is such an exciting thing, the teenager muttered. He rubbed his aching butt, wiped his eyes, and disappeared into the night. The clear night sky after the rain was untainted by a speck of dust. It was unusually quiet, and the soothing negative ions filled the forest. Before Shula left, the electromagnetic waves of 19,995 MHz swept through the area, but they didn't receive any weak signals. However, the signal node that was suddenly interrupted was still recorded. The electronic surveillance network that covered the entire Federation received the report immediately, and in the shortest time possible, it was sent to the Donglin region network composed of 17 satellites. The information-gathering satellite used the simplest logical calculation method to come up with a logical judgment that was consistent with the sentence logic. It was given a specific outsourced characteristic, and it was cut into 3 pieces of information. According to the established pattern, it was sent to the depths of space. All of this was the normal reaction of the Federation's electronic surveillance network. The various regions didn't have a central computer, but a digital matrix was used to perform the analysis. The disappearance of an information node represented the death of a citizen. This separation of life and death was all too common in the Federation. It happened every day, every moment, and even every second. Of course, the information-gathering satellite didn't think it was strange. If it had human emotions, it would probably yawn to express its boredom at this piece of information. The 3 pieces of information that were given encryption characteristics at the very beginning set off from the satellite above the Donglin region and took 3 different paths in space. After passing through 9 information amplification and acceleration space stations, they crossed an extremely long distance and crossed an unknown number of nebulae and dust. Finally, after 4 minutes and 12 seconds, they entered the atmosphere of the capital planet of the Federation's upper forest region. After a final information amplification and filtering, they entered the large receiver at the back of the building on the outskirts of the capital. The heavily guarded Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation, the gloomy basement, the officials in black hurriedly walking, the unusually quiet central operation room behind the large dust-proof glass, the first loyal executor of the glory of the Charter, the Federal Central Computer with an incomparably powerful computing power and an unusually large database, formed a seemingly boring but actually stressful life day after day. The 3 pieces of extremely inconspicuous information entered the central computer. The flashing images on the giant light screen paused for a moment at this moment, then returned to normal. No staff member noticed the abnormality of the central computer, because for countless years, the central computer's secret room had never required the participation of humans. On the contrary, for the sake of the central computer's safety, the Bureau of Proclamation's underground central computing department was completely isolated from the rest of the analysis department. They were only connected by cables or high-security wireless networks. Therefore, the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation regrettably missed the few lines of tiny light dots on the light screen. Citizen serial number, DLAS 420500481X information node missing. Name, Shu Le. Remarks, Federation 4427 Plan Target 2, Death Confirmed. Warning, this is an extension of a Level 1 sequence event. Serious warning, there is a 30% probability that Citizen Shu Le has entered an abnormal situation. Serial number is 72. Citizen Shu Le has entered an abnormal situation. Serial number is 72. Response, search on your own. If you can find him, initiate contact. If the target refuses, establish an observation system and submit a report for the government's reference. Abnormal Situation Handling Procedure 1, End. Chapter 32. The early morning sun shone through the glass window onto the messy pile of blankets on the bed. The fine dust particles in the air fluttered like insects under the bright light, as if they would never feel tired. The warm autumn day and the fluttering dust did not make the young man under the blankets sigh at the beauty of life. He was still like an ostrich, burying his head in his arms and continuing his deep sleep. Only after a very long time had passed did he somewhat unwillingly open his eyes. He spread out his limbs on the bed and stared blankly at the white ceiling above his head in silence. From the moment he opened his eyes, the craziness of the past 10 hours flooded Shu Le's mind like a tide. He stared blankly for a long time before realizing that he was now in the room that the boss had specially left for him, and not sleeping on the bed that he was familiar with. Everything that had happened yesterday was real, and not a nightmare. He already had a new identity, the chip on the back of his neck had been replaced, and the boss, uncle, he really was dead. Shu Le sat up and continued to stare blankly at the bedside for a while. He used his hands to rub his slightly hot face to wake himself up, but when he raised his head to look at the unfamiliar room, he still could not wake up. There was a saying in the Federation that a cunning rabbit would have at least 3 holes. Shu Le did not expect that the boss, in order to avoid the Federation's arrest warrant, would actually arrange so many escape routes in the capital city of Hushi Province. When he thought of this, a strange feeling emerged in Shu Le's heart. He felt that something was wrong. This was a single apartment that faced the street. The interior area was not large, and the furnishings were extremely simple. Apart from the large bed by the window, there was only a refrigerator, a TV screen, and a set of tables and chairs. After taking a hot shower in the bathroom, Shu Le took out a large amount of prepared food from the fridge. Without heating it up, he began to wolf down the food. It wasn't until the table was covered with leftovers and spilled milk that he felt slightly satisfied. The hunger and tiredness from yesterday were slightly washed away. It was only 10 hours of not eating, and with his physique, he should not be hungry to this extent. Shula was also very curious about this phenomenon. Where did the empty stomach and the tiredness of the body come from? Could it be because of the trembling of his body when he escaped from the temporary military camp? He did not want to think about this problem, because the only person who could explain this problem was no longer here. Although he planned to leave Hushi province at night and never come back to this room, Shula still subconsciously tidied up the room, just like how he did after eating in the mines these past few years. After finishing these things, he found that he had nothing to do. The police sirens were still sounding on the streets outside, and the after-effects of yesterday's explosion were still fermenting. Naturally, he could not go out into the streets to bask in the sun. So he began to sit by the bed in a daze again. After a while, he turned on the TV and somewhat woodenly watched the little girl with purple hair blowing out the candles on the screen. He suddenly remembered that today was the 16th birthday celebration of himself and the uncle's favorite, Jen Shueya. He also remembered that he was going to be 18 years old, and that the uncle did not know how old he was, and that he would remain at this age forever. So his heart tightened, and he could no longer control his emotions. Looking at Jen Shueya surrounded by tens of thousands of people on the screen, tears flowed down his face. Shula lowered his head and wiped away the tears on his face. He did not notice that on the screen, Jen Shueya was beaming as she showed the beautiful bracelet on her wrist to the people around her. For the entire day, Shula stayed in this room. Through the information screen on the bracelet, he firmly memorized what he should remember and how to escape from Donglin. At the same time, he took a huge risk and used the knowledge that his boss had taught him to secretly infiltrate the internal network of Donglin's second police station in an attempt to find the current situation of Li Wei and the group of orphans. Then, he entered the civil affairs system and checked the internal information of the fourth museum of the past. Fortunately, he found a suitable target. After doing all this, he cleaned the entire room again and carefully wiped away his fingerprints. Then, he took out a set of clothes from the closet and changed into it. Carrying the backpack that his boss had left in the closet, he walked out of the room, down the stairs, and into the crowd. Wearing a light blue sports jacket with the hood turned up to cover his face and a dark black backpack, Shula looked like a common young man in the Federation. He would not attract anyone's attention. He purposely chose to leave at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was the time when people were most relaxed. Even so, he carefully walked around a few blocks and climbed over 2 walls before entering the fourth museum of the past. Following the map that his boss had left behind, Shula quietly sneaked into the automatic incinerator behind Jingxing Hall. Among the rows of waiting coffins, he found his target according to the name tag. He did not dare to look at the face of the young body in the coffin. Instead, he turned his body sideways and aimed his left wrist at the back of the body's neck. A burnt smell flashed past. The discarded chip that he had replaced last night had successfully entered the body of the body. He then threw the glowing blue signal blocker into the coffin. After pausing for a moment, he threw in the exquisite taser baton. He had only made 2 taser batons. The first one had brought disaster to him and his boss. He did not want the second one. Although it could protect him, he felt that it was ominous. Standing in the shadows of Jingxing Hall's dark corridor, Shula silently watched the conveyor belt send the coffins into the high-temperature incinerator one by one. Watching the coffins that contained his chip, his boss's signal blocker, and the taser baton enter the furnace and quickly burn into flames, ashes, and residue, Shula's heart suddenly felt empty. Everything in his past had been burned with this coffin. Now, he only had the name Shula. The yesterday that abandoned me will never come back. At night, Shula bought a ticket to Fuji. This long-distance bus, called the Big Greyhound by the people of Donglin, was dispatched from the capital of Hushi every night. After a long night's journey, it arrived at the capital of Fuji in the early hours of the next day. Although it was tiring, it was much cheaper than taking a plane. However, Shula chose the Big Greyhound to leave the capital of Hushi because the orphans knew that the Federation was the most lenient when it came to the means of transportation used by civilians. On the bright signboard, The two big greyhounds' ears drooped weakly. Shula looked at the armed soldiers and the police wearing bulletproof vests at the entrance and lamented in his heart. He really did not expect that the government would not relax the inspection. If he did not even have the courage to face this hurdle, then how could he live in the Federation with this fake identity in the future? Shula touched the back of his neck and smiled brilliantly. He smiled so much that his eyes narrowed. He calmly walked towards the door. Chapter 33. He politely asked Shula to remove his backpack, and the cold metal probe stick rudely pressed against the back of Shula's neck. After a beep, the identity data reading and verification was completed in an instant. The soldier in charge of the inspection glanced at the information on the small screen on his elbow, looked at Shula with a smile, and said, "So it's Senior. You look young." Shula's smile was somewhat forced, and the corners of his mouth twitched a few times before it became more natural. He put on his backpack and said, "Squatters, they can't see the sun all day. If you want to, you can go." There were not many types of soldiers in the Donglin garrison, but the most difficult of them all was the mineshaft maintenance team, which was what the soldiers called the squatters. The soldier patted Shula's shoulder with a smile and said, "Senior, your luck was bad in the past, but isn't it good this time? You can wait for a ship as soon as you retire. After our former squad leader retired, he had to wait for half a year in the garrison before the Department of Defense sent a spaceship over." They chatted for a while, but because there were still many passengers waiting in line for the inspection, the soldier reluctantly let Shula go and waved his hand to let him pass. Shula walked a few steps and did not forget to turn back and thank the soldier. Everything was very normal, but when he sat on the big Greyhound bus and leaned back in the seat, he realized that his back was full of cold sweat, soaking through his clothes. Shula gently exhaled, spitting out the tension in his body. He wiped the beads of sweat on his forehead and sat down tiredly on the soft chair. It was just a checkpoint, but it had already scared him quite a bit. Fortunately, he remembered the identity set by the disguise chip behind his neck, so he barely passed the checkpoint. But then he thought, if in the future someone really found out that he was from the mineshaft, what would he do? Being able to pass the inspection so easily had nothing to do with Shula's luck. The entire Federation had long gotten used to the convenience, speed, and accuracy of the Federation's electronic surveillance network. The human chip had long since replaced identity documents. Except for certain important areas of the Federation that might carry out fingerprint and iris comparisons, the majority of identity confirmations relied on the human chip. Every citizen of the Federation was shrouded in the glory of the first charter from the day they were born, so much so that everyone subconsciously came to the conclusion that the electronic surveillance network would never make a mistake. In fact, for countless years, the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation and the electronic surveillance network throughout the Federation Society had indeed not made any mistakes, except for that mechanic and the youth who was currently sitting limply on the long-distance bus. 23 days later, in the capital of Fuji State, the sky was gloomy and so was Shula's heart. He sat in a fast food restaurant on the corner of the street, eating the beef noodles in front of him tastelessly. From time to time, he would raise his head and anxiously look at the solemn building in the middle of the street in the distance. He chose to have his lunch here because this fast food restaurant was the closest to the first instance court in the state of Foggy. He could immediately inquire about the trial today. The police car flashed its lights and turned off its siren as it drove past the street outside the fast food restaurant. Shula looked out through the glass window. At this moment, he was a little absent-minded. He immediately lowered his head and buried his face in the wide bowl of noodles. He felt like he saw the faces of Li Wei and Xiao Qiong in the police car just now. The orphan gang that Li Wei was in had disbanded under the attack of the second police station. For some unknown reason, the trial of the case was arranged to be in the first instance court in the state of Foggy. The Federation's operation to eliminate the mechanic was top secret. Naturally, it was impossible for them to charge the orphans of Clock Tower Street with the meaningless crime of colluding with traitors. Li Wei, who was completely innocent, was finally sentenced to a year in prison. This was because he had just turned 18. This result was quite good. Presumably, The lawyer assigned to Li Wei by the government would not recommend him to appeal to the Court of Appeals or the Circuit Court. However, Shula still felt sorry for Li Wei. It was not only because of the prison sentence, but also because he knew that Shula definitely felt sorry for himself. This was because the Federation government knew about the existence of Shula and the mechanic from him. More importantly, Li Wei must have thought that Shula was already dead. "Young man, why are you frowning?" The old man sitting opposite Shula, who was also eating noodles, looked at the young man's distressed expression and said with a smile, "At such a young age, you are already pretending to be lonely and imitating despair. This is unacceptable." Even an old man eating noodles on the street could say such interesting words. Shula suddenly felt that the heavens had no eyes, allowing him to be surrounded by such strange people. He didn't know why, but he suddenly had the urge to tell his secrets, but he had no one to tell them to. He stared blankly at the old man's wrinkled face and asked, "Old man, have you ever encountered any big trouble in your life? Has there been anything that has made you sad?" "No." The old man's answer was very straightforward. He had the crispness of the people of Donglin. In this world, there is no obstacle that cannot be overcome. If you really can't overcome it, then it is your fate. Who can fight against fate? It is just a little bitter. Think about it. When have we, the people of Donglin, ever been afraid of hardship? We also do not complain to the Federation about anything. Living happily is not better than anything else. But I just want to live an honest life. There are also troubles that will come to me, and I might even be wronged. Then don't live too honestly. The old man licked the oil soup on the side of his lips and said, "Just like noodles, you need to be chewy, but the broth needs to be smooth and oily. This way, you will not be bullied in society." The Donglin area was rich in stones, but it was also rich in silent and optimistic people like the old man, who were as tough as weeds. Shula suddenly thought of the people around him in this life. His emotions calmed down, and he thought of the things that he had not thought of because of his fatigue, anxiety, and sadness. There had been that explosion many years ago, and the boss had survived. Why couldn't he survive this time? Perhaps the boss had switched to another chip and was pretending to be an old university professor. Was he fooling those young female university students? Or perhaps the boss had transformed into a business rookie and was playing with his ability to get money without risking anything. Or perhaps the boss was in some corner laughing at his depression and sadness. Shula looked at the old man across from him and said, "Your surname can't be Fong, right?" The old man's surname was naturally not Fong. He looked at the neurotic youth, sighed, and left with the bowl of noodles. Shula sent off the old man sent by the heavens to wake him up. He smiled foolishly at the broth and understood what kind of person he should be in the future. Just like the noodles in the bowl, he should persevere in what he should persevere in and maintain the tenacity in his heart. But to realize the form of tenacity, the boss might be dead, or he might be alive. It was just that he could not meet him. He was wearing a white robe and drifting away. Was this true? But what did it matter? If they did not meet for a lifetime, what was the difference between life and death? The key was what to do about his future, wasn't it? Shula had a smile on his face and cheered for himself in his heart. At this moment, this simple and sincere youth's mentality finally changed a little. It was like a ray of sunlight shining into his heart. At this time, the gloomy weather above Fuji had finally dissipated, revealing the incomparably beautiful sunlight. The youth walked out of the restaurant and whistled nervously at the girls on the street. He tightened the backpack on his back and walked in the direction of the garrison. Chapter 34. Before leaving the Hashi region, Shula had circled to the 4th Street in the twilight. He took a look at his beloved repair shop from afar and was shocked to find that the entire building where the shop was located had been reduced to ruins. He did not need to care about how the Federation would explain this matter to society. He could only easily see that the Donglin garrison had directly used heavy firepower to launch an attack on his boss. Comparing this with the formation of the Mecha Team B4 that the colonel belonged to, Shula felt a chill in his heart. He did not know just how many important people in the Federation wanted to kill his boss, and what was up with the crime of treason that his boss bore. However, Shula did not have the extravagant hope of using the disguise chip to investigate this matter and help his boss clear his name or take revenge. On one hand, it was because his boss had given him a serious warning in his last words. On the other hand, he knew that he was just an ordinary person now. He was too far away from the secrets of the upper echelons of the Federation Society. He was so far away that he could not even look up to them. Standing on the empty cement ground of the garrison area's airport, Shula turned around and looked at the familiar planet. He took a deep breath, and his eyebrows, which were as thick and straight as knives, became much smoother. It was as if he could not bear the sorrow of leaving. As a retired soldier, he boarded a spaceship on the way to leave the Donglin region and head to the capital ring. This seemed to be his dream for more than 10 years. However, when this dream was realized in a bizarre way, Shula still felt like he was dreaming. The identity verification and security check had been completed before he entered the garrison. At this time, Shula was no longer as scared as he was a month ago. Instead, he could calmly face the omnipresent electronic surveillance network. He lowered his head and walked into the transit cabin, not forgetting to smile at the soldiers at the door. These soldiers were all from the Westwoods. They were responsible for the security of the commercial spaceship above the Donglin region. After a month, the friendly visit between the Westwoods region and the Donglin region ended. They reached a package of reciprocal agreements and confirmed the assistance of the Westwoods to the Donglin region. Those important officials had already returned to the spaceship and were about to embark on the long journey home. The cargo spaceship that Shula entered was the last transit cabin in space. Shula's body was pressed tightly against the back of the chair. The feeling of his head being filled with blood was very unfamiliar to him. He, who had never experienced space travel before, felt a fresh excitement and a trace of fear. Other than him, there was no one else in the cabin full of goods. He didn't know how Uncle Feng set up the disguise chip, but this retired soldier really didn't pay much attention to him, other than the loud noise that reminded him that he was leaving his hometown. When he was about 30,000 meters away from the ground, Shula finally relaxed. Following the instructions of the electronic equipment in the cabin, he adjusted the position of his seat. Only then did he have the extra energy to observe the flight cabin that he was in. Unlike what he had imagined when he was a teenager, these spaceships that represented the level of human civilization were not very beautiful. Even if it was just an open space transit cabin, it still looked a bit too crude. The exposed metal on the cabin walls were not covered, and he could even see the circuit system inside the pipes. The smell of engine oil filled the cabin. Looking at this scene, Shula could not help but be a little surprised. He thought to himself, is this a fucking old truck or an extremely sophisticated high-tech product? 20 seconds later, Shula lost his initial sense of novelty and curiosity. The physiological effects of the load began to appear. His breathing was a little short, but fortunately, in the past 4 years, he had been constantly adjusted by Uncle Feng. Compared to other first-time travelers, he had adapted quickly enough and was calm enough. He noticed that the window of the spaceship began to constantly pass by the red dust and some space junk that reflected a metallic luster. Logically speaking, at the current altitude, there should not be so much space junk. Shula was a little confused for a while. He just quietly watched. After a long time, the spaceship seemed to have passed through this strange dust area and truly escaped the gravitational pull of Donglin. It was time to remove the restraints on his body. Shula carefully left the chair according to the instructions. He felt the strange feeling of weightlessness, and a happy smile appeared on his face. Like a fish, he swung his arms and slowly swam to the side of the porthole. He held the edge of the window with both hands. He did not know if the spaceship was facing the direction of the star at this time. The light outside the window was unusually bright, and the entire cabin was illuminated with a silvery white light. This bright silvery white light illuminated the metal bracelet on Shula's left wrist very clearly. It even showed some very faint marks that were not easy to find. Shula looked down and found 2 lines of small words engraved on the edge of the bracelet. He had not noticed it for the past few days, and he could not help but be surprised. He subconsciously read it softly. In this world, there are 2 things that can deeply shake people's hearts. One is the noble moral code in our hearts, and the other is the brilliant starry sky above our heads, can't. Shula wanted to touch his head, but he found that in the absence of gravity, he swung his hand a little too hard. It hit his head, and it was a little painful. He looked at these two lines a little gloomily. He did not know who Kant was, and he was not very clear about the meaning of these seemingly very philosophical words. However, he still had a strange feeling in his heart. This feeling was perhaps called passion, or perhaps it was called loftiness. Retracting his gaze from these words, Shula looked at the universe outside the window. The young man, who was preparing to greedily absorb the beautiful scenery, suddenly narrowed his eyes. The scenery outside was completely beyond his expectations. Countless stars were like sesame seeds on a pie, sprinkling over the entire vast universe. The silvery white starlight did not shine, and it was like a holy light enveloping the surrounding. Shula looked at this scene with his mouth agape. He grew up in the Donglin area and could only see a few pitiful stars at night. He did not know that the real starry sky outside the atmosphere was so beautiful and dazzling. Suddenly, Shula's body fell heavily to the ground. He was in pain from the fall because he was so shocked by the sea of stars outside the window that he did not notice the electronic device reminding him that the docking was successful. The gravity was reset, and please return to the restraining chair. After 5 minutes, the cabin door was finally opened. The battered Shula climbed up from the ground, found his backpack, and followed the receptionist of the commercial spaceship into the real spaceship. Shula found that his eyes were not enough. When he thought about the fact that he was in fact in the endless abyss of the universe, he felt a little strange. When he thought about how the equipment he saw were all high-end goods that could only be seen in books, he felt a little instinctive excitement. The Department of Defense is too stingy. The soldier in charge of leading the way was not surprised by Shula's reaction. He shrugged and patted him on the shoulder comfortingly. Although we do have to pass by the capital star, the Department of Defense is so stingy. There's no other way. The rooms are already full. I have to ask you to stay in Area 32. No problem. Shula nodded. After all, this was the spaceship of the Westwoods people and not the Department of Defense's own troop carrier. It was good enough that he had a room. In the empty Area 32, Shula stood alone by the giant window, carrying his backpack. He looked at the distant East Forest planet and sighed. Just as he was about to find his room, he suddenly heard a very young and clear voice behind him. It made him want to protect it. Protect me. Shula turned around abruptly. Then his mouth fell open because he saw a little girl in white pajamas, bathed in the silver starlight. The little girl was only 5 or 6 years old. She was holding a doll in her arms. Her innocent eyes were filled with tears, and her whole body seemed to emit a delicate aura. Chapter 35. Protect me. She didn't add the word please in front, which seemed a little unreasonable, but when it was said in a little girl's voice, it was full of incomparable trust and the naivety of a child. The little girl's white pajamas looked incomparably delicate under the starlight. Shula looked at this scene emotionally, and for some reason, his heart softened for no reason. He clenched his fists and slowly approached the metal cabin wall. His movements were very slow, as if he was afraid that if his movements were too big, he would bring fear to this pitiful little bird-like girl. The little girl lowered her head, as if she didn't dare to look directly at Shula's face. 2 drops of tears slid down from her long eyelashes, and she looked extremely pitiful. Her lilac-like lips opened and closed nervously, and her voice was so low that it was almost inaudible. Please protect me. Shula carefully squatted down and looked at the little girl's small face that was carved from jade. Her slightly drooping eyes couldn't hide her ink-like pupils, and her small and delicate lips. For a moment, he felt a little absent-minded. He felt that the little girl gave him a very intimate feeling, so he didn't notice that the little girl added 2 words in her second sentence. Little girl, what's your name? Shula subconsciously blinked and pursed his lips, not wanting to let his absent-minded appearance make the little girl think of something bad. His gaze finally left the little girl's face and noticed that the little girl's hair was very special. Pure black hair draped straight over both sides of her cheeks, and the middle part was very neatly cut into a straight line above her eyebrows and covering her forehead. It looked like a piece of watermelon skin. My name is Zhong. Firework. The little girl was still tightly hugging the doll in her arms. She bravely raised her head to look at Shula. Perhaps it was Shula's honest face that gave her courage, or perhaps it was Shula's straight eyebrows that gave her confidence. She stammered out her name. This name is too unpleasant to hear. Shula muttered in his heart. He didn't know what this little girl's parents did for them to give her a name that could easily cause ambiguity. He scratched his head and said, "Why don't I just call you Little Watermelon?" The little girl named Zhong Firework widened her eyes and felt endless confusion. She cutely tilted her head and asked, "Uncle, why Little Watermelon?" Shula stretched out his index finger and brushed the hair on the little girl's forehead. He smiled and said, "Because your hair is like a beautiful piece of watermelon skin." Although Shula didn't know that this commercial spaceship belonged to the Ancient Clock Company, and that the 4th Military Region was hiding behind the Ancient Clock Company, he could logically deduce that on such a heavily guarded spaceship, under the glory of the First Charter, at the edge of the universe far away from the Empire's borders, there shouldn't be anything that could threaten such a cute little girl. He also didn't think that this little girl called Zhonghuahua or Little Watermelon needed to be protected. On a spaceship, this little girl should have a family accompanying her. But no matter how he asked, Little Watermelon refused to tell him what had happened, nor where her family was. Shula thought for a while and decided to find the staff on the spaceship. After all, the little girl was a living person, and he didn't dare to take responsibility. Shula's room was in Area 32, which was the most remote area of the spaceship. It had the most backward facilities and was also the quietest area. Other than the noise of garbage being transported from the pipes behind the wall from time to time, no one had come here while the two of them were talking. Shula took the little girl's hand and walked outside. He comforted her, "Little Watermelon, you don't have to be afraid when you find your family." "Uncle, I'm scared." Little Watermelon was a very sensible child. She probably knew that she had brought a lot of trouble to this strange uncle. When Shula took her hand and walked out, she didn't make a fuss or struggle. She just held the doll in one hand and lowered her head as she said, "There's a bad guy who wants to kidnap Little Watermelon and take her somewhere else so that Little Watermelon can never see father and mother again." Shula stopped in his tracks. He turned around and looked at the little girl's side profile seriously, as if he was trying to discern whether this terrifying story was just a child's nonsense, or whether there was a dark curtain hidden behind the light. With this glance, he saw the dust and dirt on the back of the little girl's snow-white nightgown and the stain on the doll. No one came to Area 32. How did this little girl come here alone on such a big spaceship? What about the people who were watching over her? Did the little girl crawl out from those pipes? Otherwise, how could she be so dirty? What kind of horror would make a 5 or 6-year-old girl crawl into those dark pipes? Shula looked at her seriously for a while. Uncle Fong admired his ability to read people, but he still couldn't see any trace of the little girl lying. Without thinking for too long, Shula turned around and walked back with the little girl's hand. He wanted to go back to his room and think about it. He was a little worried about leaving the little girl in the hands of the spaceship staff. At least, she would be safe if she followed him. It would be good for him to find out more information before making a decision. The little girl stared blankly for a moment before immediately understanding the meaning behind this turnaround. She walked quickly in small, quick steps in an attempt to keep up with Shula's pace. Her movements appeared especially cute. The tears on her little face had yet to dry when she began to laugh. Her laughter was exceptionally happy, and her large black eyes narrowed together like a crescent moon in the night sky of Shalene Star. "Thank you, Uncle. Call me Big Brother from now on. Little Watermelon." Shula had always been a straightforward person. Once he decided on something, he would do it to the end. Holding the little girl's hand, he was in a very good mood. His trustworthy eyes squinted, looking very much like the half-lake in the East Woods Nature Conservation Area. The ancient Bell spaceship was still going through its last logistical energy supply. It was set to leave the East Woods sector at about 6 o'clock tomorrow. During this time, Shula stayed in his room with Little Watermelon. Perhaps because the budget of the Department of Defense was too tight, the place where he, a retired soldier in name, lived was really a forgotten corner. There didn't seem to be any surveillance equipment in the room. Even so, Shula still carefully paid attention to the movements outside the door. Through this period of chatting, he gradually gained the little girl's complete trust and finally found out some things. The little girl was from the West Woods. For some reason, she left home and was taken to the ancient Bell spaceship. On the return journey, she would be sent to the capital planet. She would be 6 years old in 2 months. She was best at piano and painting, but she hated piano and painting the most. She liked to play with mud the most, and it just so happened that she played with mud the least. Perhaps it was because she rarely had the chance to relax and chat like this. The 6-year-old girl chattered non-stop like a little bird. She would often choke because she spoke too fast. Her little face would turn red, and the straight black hair on her forehead would sway in the air. Shula listened with a bitter smile. The little girl's content was too trivial, and there was no information that he wanted to know. The more he listened, the stranger he felt. He wondered if the little girl had misunderstood something, causing him to misunderstand something. But since he had already promised little watermelon, he naturally had to continue. People had to be honest, even if it was a 6-year-old girl. Shula decided to let the little girl hide in her room for the time being before he could find out more information. When it was time to eat, Shula reminded the little girl not to run around. He ran to the spaceship's cafeteria and ordered a meal. He didn't talk too much with the spaceship staff, but he still paid attention and found that no one had heard anything about which official on the spaceship lost a child. What made him wary was that the soldiers in charge of security around the cafeteria looked much more serious than they did a few hours ago. A somewhat depressing atmosphere surrounded the cafeteria. Could it be because of little watermelon? Shula quietly left the cafeteria. He was a person who didn't attract much attention, so he didn't attract any attention when he left with a meal. Most people on the spaceship didn't even know that a retired soldier from the Donglin region had been arranged to stay in the lounge of cleaning area 32. Little watermelon lowered her head and forked a piece of beef. She put it in her mouth and chewed hard, but the expression on her face revealed that the little girl really didn't like the taste of beef stew rice. But she didn't seem to want to make things difficult for Shula, so she just ate seriously. Shula looked at the expression on her little face and couldn't help but laugh. He said, "If you don't like it, then don't eat it. I heard that the next meal will be good. I've been eating beef for a month and a half." Little watermelon sighed like an adult and said, "Brother Shula, I'm afraid the next meal will be beef again." Shula deliberately added a spoonful of white rice to this meal. At this time, he was holding his chopsticks and eating the leftover rice from little watermelon. When he heard this, he couldn't help but freeze. After being influenced by the boss for so many years, he had become very picky about food. He said with a bitter face, "Synthetic beef tastes the same, and you can actually eat it for a month and a half. That's amazing." After sighing, Shula lowered his head and ate again. He didn't have the habit of wasting food. With his mouth full of beef, he said vaguely, "If there's a chance in the future, I'll kill a bison and let you eat real beef." The little girl's black hair stood straight on her forehead. She looked at Shula with a smile and nodded seriously. Although she had eaten a lot of wild dishes stolen from the Empire with her father in the Westwoods, she still felt grateful for Brother Shula's words. She thought that her brother was really a good person. Chapter 36. In the faint sound of the engine, the fixed curtains on the room's porthole slowly opened, and the starlight outside the spaceship shone in. Shula, who was engrossed in chewing the synthetic beef, looked up in surprise. He found the little girl with the watermelon haircut looking out of the window quietly. The corners of her mouth were slightly raised, and she smiled sweetly. Her tender face was full of envy. It was not until then that Shula noticed that the little watermelon's eyes were not big, but they were exceptionally bright. At this time, when she smiled, her eyes narrowed, and she looked very cute. The young man smiled in his heart, thinking that the intimacy he felt when they first met probably came from these eyes. He followed the little watermelon's gaze and looked out of the window. His eyes were fixed in the distance. He slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand and sighed softly. Outside the window was his hometown, Donglin. Thinking of this and changing identities, He did not know if he could ever come back in this lifetime. No matter how optimistic and cheerful Shula was, he felt a little down. Perhaps because he didn't want his emotions to affect the little girl, he forced a smile, pointed at the planet, and said, "I've never thought of looking at it from this angle. The picture albums I used to see in school were much more beautiful than the real picture." The quiet planet was suspended in space. The blue sea and green fields were clearly visible. Even the spaceship could see the strangely large white mine pits, like scars that described the ancient history of the planet. However, at the edge of the planet's atmosphere, there was a layer of grey and light red dust, making the scenery look like it was covered with a layer of gauze. When it fell into the eyes of Shula, who was in a bad mood, he could not help but feel a little uncomfortable. That is the legacy of the early days of the planet's development. The little watermelon scratched her hair cutely. She knew at a glance what Shula was referring to. She explained in a childish voice, "The 3 major galaxies of the Federation are at the edge of the silver core. The density of stars in space is too high. Although the Creator magically arranged 3 galaxies for human beings, and they were not torn to pieces by the gravitational force, the light pollution is still very serious. In particular, Donglin is too close to the stars in the system. Without this layer of red soil particle belt shielding the rays, it would be difficult for human beings to survive healthily." Little Watermelon looked at Shula and nodded, saying seriously, "Big brother, although the dust is ugly, it is really useful." "Ah, are you saying that the dust is man-made?" "That's right. It seems to have been the largest group explosion in history. At the same time, it was precisely calculated by the 5-man team that the effect was achieved." Shula was stunned for a long time. Until today, he finally knew why the sky was always so grey and the stars were always so few. It turned out that everything was covered by the dust. Thinking of how many tens of thousands of years ago, when humans first came to the eastern forest region from the center of the Federation and developed the desolate planet with great difficulty, he was full of respect for those ancestors. He looked at Little Watermelon's swaying black hair, shook his head, and laughed bitterly. Another reason why he was shocked was that even a 6-year-old girl knew the history, but he didn't. Although he didn't finish his compulsory education, it was too embarrassing. Little Watermelon took the tissue he handed to her and wiped her mouth. She was smart enough to feel Shula's uneasiness. She smiled sweetly and said, "This is not in the history textbooks. I just heard from my father that our ancestors were the first people to come to the eastern forest region to develop. In order to remember the great achievements of our ancestors, I started reading these things when I was young." Hearing the explanation, Shula felt a little better. However, he noticed another strange thing. If it was an ancient family responsible for developing the eastern forest region, why was Little Watermelon's family now in the West Woods? But this was not a question he needed to consider now, so he did not ask further. "Only after flying out of the atmosphere did I realize how bright the stars are in the vast universe." Shula lowered his head and thought of his boss, who might have been turned into flying ash and scattered on the eastern forest planet. He thought of Li Wei, who was imprisoned by the Federation. He laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "My dream in life was to become a battleship auxiliary officer in the Federation. Now it seems that if I stay on the battleship every day, I will become a stray cat in the mine." "Brother Shula, what's wrong with stray cats?" "Stray cats in the mine. As long as they are illuminated by the headlights, they will stupidly stand on the tracks and never move again. It is probably because they have never seen such bright light before." Shula lowered his head and said this, but another voice sounded in his heart. A new life was waiting for him. However, even if he did not avenge his boss and wash away the injustice, he could not risk his life for the Federation at 6 o'clock the next day. Shula, who was lying on the floor and sleeping with his clothes on, was awakened by a loud roar. He put on his coat and lifted a corner of the curtain to look. He found that the eastern forest planet, which was covered with a layer of dust of history, was gradually moving away from him. He knew that the spaceship had finally embarked on its journey to the capital planet. For a moment, he had mixed feelings, but he could not find the right words to describe his feelings. A month ago, he was just an orphan living peacefully on the eastern forest planet. His dream in life was to take the Department of Defense Mechanic Officer examination and then enter the military or enter the capital ring to further his studies and obtain a decent job in a large company. At that time, he had only taken the tram and had not even taken a plane. Apart from the 17 blocks in the capital of the Hushi state, he had not been anywhere else. He was a complete country bumpkin. However, a month later, he left the Hushi state and boarded a plane to another distant state, Foggy State. He even boarded the Federation's most advanced commercial spaceship and flew in space. He was about to go to the truly distant capital ring. Life's encounters were always so bizarre and unpredictable. Shula was a little annoyed as he scratched his messy hair. When he turned around and saw the little girl sleeping soundly on the bed, his heart tightened. There was a very dramatic question waiting for him here. He believed that the little girl was not lying, but he did not understand why these strange things always happened to him. He did not think that the little girl was trouble or a burden because he was a person with such a character. As long as someone came to him in need, he was always willing to do his best to help, not to mention that the other party was just a poor little girl. Half an hour later, the roaring sound stopped. In the long silence, the commercial spaceship Ancient Bell left the eastern forest planet and quietly moved into the depths of the universe like a floating bottle. Its speed was getting faster and faster, but the people on the spaceship did not feel anything. In the world of the Great System, the speed of the naked eye had lost its effect. There was only a sense of loss that shrouded the huge alloy spaceship. In the next few days, Shula maintained an absolute low profile on the spaceship. Other than going to the cafeteria to get food, he did not have much contact with the people on the spaceship. Not many people paid attention to this poor retired soldier who lived in the cleanup district. Although he kept a low profile, Shula was still trying to find the little girl's family or something strange. However, it was to no avail. After several inquiries, he did not hear anything similar at all. Shula didn't have a choice. He really didn't want to go against the little girl's wishes. Moreover, he had gradually gotten used to the little girl's existence in the room. Perhaps her existence could make his disguised escape journey less cold and lonely. What surprised Shula even more was that the little girl, who was not even 6 years old, knew a lot. It seemed that her family had a good environment and had trained her to read books since she was young. Although Shula had not been attending school for the past few years, she had still been working hard in the state university's library as per Uncle Feng's instructions. She had a wide range of knowledge and was very knowledgeable. Even so, she would sometimes be stumped by this little girl's questions. Talking, chatting, and playing games together was the best way to close the distance between people and gain trust. During the long space travel, it didn't take long for the two children to become familiar with each other. Because of the psychological needs of each other, they quickly trusted each other and relied on each other at a speed that exceeded the speed of time. Little Watermelon, you sneaked out of the room by yourself. Do you still remember where the room is? Shula asked subconsciously one day. He did not have much hope because the ancient bell was too big. How could a 6-year-old girl remember the location? Unexpectedly, the little Watermelon blinked her eyes, then raised her finger and pointed to the ceiling of the room. Shula was stunned and only reacted after a long time. After inquiring for the past few days, he knew some things about the ancient bell. The spaceship's residential area was divided into 2 floors. Besides the upper floor of the spaceship staff, the upper floor was occupied by the big shots that no one had ever seen before. Are you sure? Shula looked into her eyes and asked. The little Watermelon nodded and then said in a trembling voice, "But I don't want to go back. Tell me the place and I'll check it out." The little Watermelon lowered her head and hugged the doll, whispering, "Brother Shula, I only dare to take you to the place where I crawled out." Shula, who was covered in dust, stared at the little Watermelon in his hand. He could not understand how this little girl could accurately pass through the complicated air conditioning system of the spaceship and directly take him from Area 32 to a completely unfamiliar place. He patted the dust off his body and carefully pushed open the heavy cabin door in front of him. He saw a piece of military green tarpaulin. Shula curiously lifted the tarpaulin and was surprised to see a mechanical arm facing him. The owner of the mechanical arm was a very tattered old mech. It was unknown how many years it had been left here. It was covered with dust from history. Chapter 37. Shula cautiously reached out a finger to touch the mechanical arm that was facing him. His fingertips were immediately covered in dust, and the 3-section alloy finger at the top of the mechanical arm also showed its original color. It glowed faintly with a black light, but the black light was somewhat dim. This dust-shrouded mecha had been placed here by some unknown person for many years, like a sword quietly waiting for its owner. Although covered in dust, it was immortal. The cold sensation traveled from his fingertips to his brain, and Shula exhaled softly, his eyes filled with suppressed excitement. This was the first time in his life that he had seen a real mecha with his own eyes, and at such a close distance too, within reach. In that instant when he touched it with his finger, he was even worried that this mecha would come to life on its own. Of course, Shula had already seen quite a number of pictures of mecha in the related periodicals and magazines in the library. A month ago, on the treetop of the hill, he had also seen 11 of the latest model black mecha besieging Uncle Fong alone. However, in the end, it could not compare to the shock of being able to touch one right now. This was the most powerful close combat weapon of the Federation military, something that usually only existed in the fantasies of the average Federation youth. Shula looked excitedly at this worn-out mecha, but found that this mecha was not only old, its design was also particularly clumsy. It was only because its height was almost touching the ceiling that it showed a bit of deterrence. The weapon loading system on the mecha had long been stripped away, and the connecting parts of the alloy components were also damaged. He did not know if it could still move. Shula found a nameplate somewhere inside the mechanical leg of this worn-out mecha. Wiping away the dust on it, he stared blankly at the words written on it. He did not understand when the Federation had produced this type of mecha. Little Watermelon, who had been quietly letting him hold her hand, also poked her little head out curiously. After a few glances, she said, "Big brother, M02. M02, the first generation of mecha from the Federation's 37th constitutional era. It was considered a semi-finished product, but the subsequent mecha designs basically followed the design of this model, including the current Federal military's most advanced M52 series mecha. They could all be considered its descendants." Shula raised his head and sighed as he looked at the shabby mecha. Who would have thought that he would actually have the chance to see such a legendary antique? "It's broken." Little Watermelon noticed the excitement and eagerness in Shula's eyes, so he cautiously reminded him, "I've taken it back." Shula scratched his head and chuckled. He also felt that his impulse at this time was somewhat unreasonable. He forcibly suppressed his desire to continue watching the mecha. After all, compared to his own interests, solving Little Watermelon's problem was more important at the moment. He held the Little Watermelon's hand and continued to walk to the other side of the room. He pulled out the toolbox on the wall, removed the screws for the air conditioning channel, and went in. Without looking back, he said directly, "Wait for me here. Don't run around." This garbage collection cabin, or rather, waste storage cabin, was very remote. No one would come here for many years, so Shula was not worried about the Little Watermelon's safety. However, not long after he went into the channel, he crawled back with a dusty face. Panting, he squatted in front of the Little Watermelon and said angrily, "Why didn't you remind me? I couldn't even crawl over." Yes, although there were no monitoring electronic devices installed in the air conditioning channel, the channel itself was very small at some junctions. An adult would not be able to pass through at all. Probably only a child like the Little Watermelon could pass through these channels and freely crawl around the spaceship. Looking at the dust on Shula's face, the Little Watermelon covered his mouth and laughed. The idea of finding the Little Watermelon's room to confirm the truth was dashed. Although Shula had learned all sorts of skills from a random mechanic for a long time, he was not confident that he could be a spy in a high-tech spaceship. Perhaps it was because of his selfishness that he did not know, but in the next few days, he became quiet. He just played with the Little Watermelon in the room and ate the synthetic beef that was actually not bad, just a little monotonous. The Little Watermelon was really a very well-behaved child. There were no children's books or even a TV in Shula's remote and quiet room, but she was not noisy or bored. She just sat quietly on the bed and listened to Shula tell her a story, or she told Shula a story. Little watermelon, don't you think it's boring to stay with me? Shula seemed to be normal these days, but in fact, he was getting more and more worried. How should he deal with this little girl who suddenly appeared beside him like a fairy? Although the journey was long, there would be a day when they arrived at the capital ring. He could not take her away under the noses of so many people, and the little watermelon's family must be very worried about her. The problem was, could her family really be trusted? As long as you don't play the piano or draw, it'll be fine. The little watermelon looked into Shula's eyes and nodded seriously. Perhaps in the little girl's heart, these days of idleness was her greatest joy. Shula shrugged. He really did not understand the mindset of children. While the little watermelon was enjoying the joy of idleness, he kept feeling that something was wrong somewhere in his heart. The long period of space travel was surrounded by silence, the eternal silence. No matter how beautiful the scenery of space was, at this moment, it became boring and repetitive. Shula looked out the window at a certain dim star in the distance, and suddenly understood that the strange feeling in his heart was because he longed for something. Still covered in dust, Shula crawled for a long time through the pipes of cleanup area 32 before he finally reached the waste storage compartment with the heavy alloy door. He did not have time to be proud of his memory and not get lost in the dense network of pipes in the spaceship. He could not wait to once again lift up the army green tarpaulin and let the worn-out and abandoned old mecha appear in front of him. In this instant, Shula confirmed that his judgment was correct. These past few days, he had been longing to return here, longing to see this worn-out mecha again. At this moment, his entire body was filled with satisfaction and a faint excitement. He longed to return here and see this mecha, not because he had a strong desire to operate a mecha, although this was the desire of most of the youths in the Federation, but because he wanted to fix it. He had passed the first round of the Department of Defense's Mecha Maintenance Officer exam. Although he could no longer continue on this path, his life's ideals, or rather, the interest deeply rooted in the depths of his mind, had never diminished. From a very young age, Shula had a strong interest in fixing things. After following Uncle Fong for 4 years, this interest did not diminish, but instead grew stronger and stronger. In the mining operations room on the outskirts of Hushi State's capital, in the repair shop at 4th Street of Xianglan Avenue, whenever the youth saw the electrical appliances brought over by his neighbors, such as broken crystal TVs, hard-to-adjust electric car axles, and all sorts of damaged life chips, he would be as excited and impulsive as a vulture seeing rotten meat. He wanted to fix these broken things at the first possible moment. It was just like this worn-out mecha he was looking at now, except this mecha was not quite the same as anything he had fixed before. Shula was a man of action. Since he had crawled through the pipes to come here, he naturally would not leave just like that. He did not have the slightest bit of confidence that he would be able to fix this worn-out mecha to anything. In fact, he did not even know if he would be able to reconnect the 3 sections of metal, but he still began to work. Before he began, he maintained his good work habits. After rummaging through the dusty surface of the worn-out mecha for a long time, he finally found a vacuum plastic bag. He gave a low cry of surprise, confirming that it was just as the book had said. The bag contained the manual for the M02 mecha. Holding the manual, Shula began to read with great interest, going from standing to leaning against the wall to finally sitting down. The starlight outside the spaceship did not change, and so did his gaze. He earnestly and greedily read through all the parameter values and component construction patterns, throwing himself into it. He did not know how much time had passed. Back in Donglin District, the mechanic Uncle Fong had not taught him anything about mecha. Shula had even expressed his indignant protest and ridicule. He had painstakingly found a piece of mecha central control chip in the junkyard, but in the end, Uncle Fong had said that he did not know how to fix it. The present Shula naturally knew that his boss was no ordinary person, and it was impossible that he did not know anything about mecha. However, it was already impossible for him to ask his boss any more questions about the technical aspects of mecha. Thus, he could only immerse himself in the dry manual, learning endlessly. After a long time, Shula finally put down the manual. He lowered his head and thought seriously for a long time, and then began to get up to search for the tools and materials he needed in the waste storage compartment. At the same time, he raised his head from time to time to observe where the worn-out M02 was truly damaged. His gaze swept over the mecha's shoulder, and suddenly stopped at a hole in the ceiling outside the cabin door. He smiled guiltily. The little girl's head poked out of the hole, her black hair completely covered in dust. She looked very pitiful. Looking at Shula on the ground, she said, "Big brother, I'm hungry." Shula pushed the toolbox on the wall back to its original position, chuckling as he said, "Then I'll go get some food from the cafeteria first." Chapter 38. For a 6-year-old girl to be able to memorize the complicated piping lines in the spaceship compartment and not be afraid of the dark, running around with a doll in her arms, was in itself a shocking thing. However, Shula recalled that when he was 6 years old, he had already started to run around in the dark mine tunnels with Li Wei. When he was in the mood, he would even catch a few stray cats to play with. So, he understood. In the next few days, after eating, Shula and Little Watermelon would sneak into the air conditioning duct from cleaning area 32. Covered in dust, they would come to the waste storage compartment. Shula concentrated on learning the manuals, preparing the materials, and studying how to repair this big piece of broken mecha as much as possible. Meanwhile, Little Watermelon would crouch beside him with her doll in her arms, quietly watching Shula's every move. Fortunately, Shula's simple lounge had bathrooms and laundry facilities. Otherwise, how dirty would the two children be? But even though she washed diligently night after night, the color of Little Watermelon's white pajamas gradually darkened. Shula was very interested in the broken mecha, so he could stay there for a long time. Little Watermelon followed him every day because she was interested in Shula's focused expression. What surprised Shula was that whenever he was in some kind of predicament or had a problem with the drawing of a blueprint, Little Watermelon would always give some seemingly childish, but in fact, very creative ideas. Shula's problem with repairing the mecha was that he was unfamiliar with the structure of the mecha itself. Although he could understand the principles and working objectives of some individual chips and linkage devices through the manuals, when it came to a large-scale biological simulation framework, he was somewhat at a loss. This was especially so for this cumbersome old mecha. He had never even seen a picture of it before. Little Watermelon, on the other hand, did not know anything about electronic repair. She just seemed to have seen countless mechas in her short 6-year-old life. Intuitively, she told Shula in her childish voice what this place looked like, what this place should look like, and what this place could look like. With a general view of the outer armor, he could help with the internal repair work. Shula was pleasantly surprised, but at the same time, he had more questions about Little Watermelon's family. In today's Federation society, general energy was still abundant, but there were not many crystal mines for interstellar travel. Although the mecha used Jingnong high-energy batteries, they were extremely expensive and consumed a lot of energy. The entire federal military now probably had no more than 400 mechas. What exactly did Little Watermelon's family do? How could a 6-year-old girl see so many mechas with her own eyes? These questions flashed through Shula's mind. He did not think too deeply about it, because at this time, all his attention was attracted by the old mecha in front of him. He threw himself wholeheartedly into the repair work. Although it could not be said that he forgot to eat and sleep, it could be said that he had nothing else in his mind. And so, this old M02 mecha, which had been scrapped a long time ago and thrown into the junk compartment of the spaceship and long forgotten by people, once again played its role and became a toy for Shula and Little Watermelon. It was just that this toy was a little too big. The 3 sections of metal fingers were now connected by an alloy wire. This alloy wire had been removed from the sensor handle of an automatic walking sweeper by Shula. There was a big hole in the front of the mecha's armor. At this time, it was barely covered by a thick piece of metal that Shula did not know what it was. In fact, it was not difficult to repair the exterior of the mecha. After all, Shula did not want to repair this old mecha into a powerful weapon that could withstand artillery fire. The key was the chipset inside the mecha, the transmission device, and the information transmission sensor, which were particularly difficult to repair. Fortunately, There was more than one junk compartment in the ancient Bell spaceship. Shula was pleasantly surprised to find a lot of waste in the 3 compartments next to it. Then, he turned all of these waste metal components into the treasures he needed. The chipset was separated into 3 parts by him using alloy wires. In the absence of precision equipment, he only hoped that the chipsets would not interfere with each other. As for the damaged chips, it was impossible to repair them. As for the transmission device, Shula pinned his hopes of repairing it on the few or star vehicles in the junk compartment B. Although these 2 transmission devices were completely different models, some of the parts inside could still be interchanged. The most troublesome part was the mecha's signal transmission sensor. Shula busied himself excitedly for several days before he finally managed to pick out enough parts from the countless broken electrical appliances. He then spent even more time before he was able to put these parts together. Shula, who was covered in dust and engine oil, stared blankly at the tall mecha in front of him. He could not believe his eyes. He could not remember how long it took, but he still did not expect that he could actually put these messy parts together in such a simple and crude situation. Little Watermelon, whose face was covered in dust, hugged a doll and leaned on Shula's thigh. He squinted his eyes and looked up. After a long time, he said in a childish voice, "So ugly." It was indeed ugly. At this time, the mecha that was repaired by Shula was even uglier than before. The paint on the surface of the mecha's body had been ruined beyond recognition. The outer armor, which had been relatively complete, had been torn apart into pieces by Shula. This was because those parts could not be perfectly designed into the mecha's system, and their sizes were also completely wrong. Therefore, in order to fit the transmission mechanism in, a part of the outer shell had to be broken off. At this moment, M02 was covered in oil stains and scattered circuit boards. It looked extremely pathetic. It no longer had the solemn feeling of being hidden under the dust of history, nor did it look like an antique. It looked more like a dirty and fat beggar wearing tattered clothes. "Aya, it's really ugly." Shula reflexively rubbed his head. He raised his head to look at the mecha in front of him and said shamefully, "I don't know if it can move." Shula truly did not have the slightest bit of confidence in repairing a mecha. This was because this was the first time he had come into contact with this kind of thing. Moreover, he had completely used the method that his boss, Fengyu, had taught him to repair home appliances. This sounded a little ridiculous and completely inconceivable, so he did not dare to hope that this tattered mecha could really move. Even if those 3-section alloy fingers can move a little, I'll be satisfied. Shula looked at the mecha in front of him happily. He thought to himself that his expectations were indeed very low, but in reality, they were also very high. If he could really fix this mecha to the point where it could move, then the heavens really did not have eyes. Let's give it a try. Little Watermelon swung the hair in front of his forehead back and forth, appearing exceptionally serious. He looked at Shula and nodded encouragingly. "Big brother, maybe it really can move." There was a stable current output port in the waste storage compartment. This was something that Shula had confirmed on the first day. After hearing Little Watermelon's words, he took a deep breath and walked to the back of the beggar mecha. He connected the cable to the current output port on the wall, and then stared intently at the holographic display on the back of the mecha's waist. Only when the holographic display gradually turned red did he breathe a sigh of relief. He thought to himself that this first generation of Jingnong high-power battery was indeed worthy of being called a perfect product of legend. After more than 60 years, it was actually still usable. When the red beam rose to 1/3 of the height, Shula stopped charging. This was for safety reasons later. After all, this tattered mecha had been left here for so many years, and had been tormented by him for so long. If he started it up at full power, who knew what would happen? Although an explosion was impossible, what if it fell apart? He had encountered many accidents in the mine's operation room over the years, but today, he had such a cute little girl like Little Watermelon by his side. Of course, he had to be careful. Where's the hatch switch? Although the M02 mecha's operation hatch had long been damaged, Shula still asked. According to the instructions in the manual, the mecha's program loading button could only be activated after the hatch was opened. Little Watermelon blinked, as if recalling a certain scene. She scratched her head in distress and pointed at the protrusion below the mecha's head armor. I think it's there. Shula was already very trusting of Little Watermelon's guidance. As instructed, he smoothly opened the hatch that was no longer there. He then pressed the program loading button and began to wait silently, nervously, excitedly, and uneasily. After an indeterminate amount of time, the tattered mecha's operation hatch suddenly lit up. With a long beep, the self-check signal indicated that it had passed, and a faint, gentle glow enveloped the mecha's entire body. Shula stood dumbfounded on the chest armor of the mecha, completely unable to believe what he was seeing. Even the central control system was working? He had not harbored any hope at all for this repair work, but this mecha had actually been repaired. Although this was only repairing the most basic parts and functions of the mecha, and could not be considered a complete repair, he still felt incomparably excited and blessed. Big brother, you're a genius, Little Watermelon exclaimed, clapping her little palms excitedly from the ground. Of course, I've always been a genius. Shula was still in a state of shock. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and subconsciously said this with a smile. However, he suddenly felt as if his heart had been struck by a heavy object, and he froze on the mecha high up in the air. Li Wei had once said that he was a genius, and Boss had also said that. Boss, he lowered his head and looked at the tattered parts of the mecha beneath his feet. Those odd-looking components, those chip monitors that were already showing signs of instability due to power issues, found them somewhat familiar. Only now did he understand why his technique had not felt at all rusty in the past few days of repairing the mecha, nor had he found it unfamiliar or difficult at all. Uncle Feng had taught him how to repair electrical appliances for 4 years, and he had even complained about it. It turned out that in the process of repairing those ordinary electrical appliances, the boss had already taught him the more precise techniques and broader thinking of how to repair mecha. Shula stood on the mecha shrouded in a gentle glow, completely dumbfounded. He thought to himself that he was a bullshit genius, but he was actually an idiot. Chapter 39. Abnormal current output in Area 38, please check. In the captain's main control room of the commercial spaceship, the computer's emotionless voice sounded. The captain acted as if he didn't hear it. He put down the coffee cup in his hand and said to himself in a nervous tone, "Where did she go? Where did she go?" It had only been a month since the spaceship left the Donglin district. During this month, the captain, who was originally fat, had obviously lost a lot of weight. His eyes, in particular, were surrounded by dark circles. He looked extremely haggard. It seemed that the cups of coffee in his hand did not help him in the slightest. There's an abnormality in Area 38. The spaceship's computer didn't repeat the warning. This time, it was the captain's secretary who spoke. The middle-aged man carefully looked at his boss and said, "Do you want to send an engineer to check it out?" "Check, check, check, check my ass." The captain suddenly became furious. He jumped up like a ball and pointed at the secretary's nose and scolded, "I don't care about that damn woman in Area 38. I don't care about that damn 3721, I want everyone to go find the miss. Find the miss. We've been looking for so damn long, why haven't we found her yet?" Obviously, this wasn't the first time the secretary had to deal with the captain's anger, so he was still calm enough. He looked down and calmly replied, "The ancient bell has a total of 42 areas. It would take a standard 5 days to search through all of them. The problem now is that we don't have enough manpower to do this. The most important thing is that the spaceship is too crowded right now, so we can't do this with great fanfare. The spaceship's central control system has been able to confirm the miss safety these days, and she is indeed on the spaceship, so Captain, please don't worry too much." Without waiting for the captain to continue to be angry, the secretary immediately suggested, "If we request the Bureau of Proclamation to help locate her, I believe that it will take at most 3 minutes to find the miss's whereabouts." The captain was silent. He had too many reasons not to let the people in the Federation know about the miss's disappearance, because this matter would cause too much trouble. The spaceship's central control system had been able to confirm the miss safety, so in addition to his anger and anxiety, he still maintained a little calmness and didn't blindly and confusedly submit an emergency request to the Bureau of Proclamation. The captain sighed and rubbed his slightly sore cheeks. He then closed his eyes and began to think. There were a total of 3 missions on the ancient clock. The first one was the friendly exchange mission between the Westwoods region and the Eastwoods region. The second was to secretly transport the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team to carry out the 4427 plan. The third was to send the young mistress to school on the capital planet. In the original plan, the Special Mecha Team that carried out the second mission had another mission, which was to be responsible for the lady's safety. However, the people from the Westwoods didn't expect that the target of Plan 4427, the traitorous mechanic, would be so powerful. In the end, it forced the ancient clock to expend a lot of energy, and at the same time, it also made the 4th Military Region pay a price. The mecha team led by Colonel Lake had been affected by the shockwave, and all of them had been heavily injured. Although none of them had died, over the past few days, a few of them had fallen into a coma, and a few of them had been vomiting non-stop. It was precisely because of this unexpected situation that there was a huge loophole in the young lady's safety protection. After the young lady went missing, the Westwoods did not have enough manpower to search for her. The fat captain opened his eyes and said angrily, "What about the student soldiers in the delegation? There hasn't been any news at all these days. Did they grow up eating shit?" There were too many people on the spaceship, and the Westwoods didn't know who could be a spy from the Investigation Bureau, or an outpost from the Bureau of Proclamation. They couldn't even confirm if there were any special agents from the Special Task Force. If they wanted to quietly find the young lady, they could only trust people from the Westwoods. Coincidentally, in the delegation that visited the Westwoods region, there was a group of students from the Westwoods Military Academy, so this serious task was given to them. However, the surveillance footage of the day the young lady went missing had been reviewed many times. The people from the Ancient Clock Company confirmed that the young lady did not leave the second floor, so the scope of the search had been limited to the upper floor. Those military academy students, who were regarded as geniuses, were like spiders with limited movement routes in a spider's web. How could they find the target who had already climbed to another tree? The secretary glanced at him, thinking that the captain and himself were both from the Westwoods Military Academy. Those 18 or 19-year-old officers should be considered their juniors. How could he have the heart to say something like growing up eating shit? He lowered his head and said, "I keep feeling that we missed something." Then expand the scope of the search. A trace of irritation flashed in the fat captain's eyes. "Go down and look, just remember not to alarm too many people. Don't let those unrelated know." As he was talking, the spaceship's communicator suddenly lit up, and a silent and cold middle-aged face appeared on the light screen. The secretary immediately stood at attention and saluted the middle-aged man on the light screen, then left the command cabin. The fat captain also stood up immediately. Although he knew that the interstellar communication had a very long delay, he still saluted meticulously and said loudly, reporting to the commander, "There is still no news. We can only confirm that she is safe." Then he immediately lowered his head and said with great shame and pain, "Boss, the fat man deserves to die." This time, the communication had not been time-corrected or tuned. The middle-aged general on the other end of the light screen spoke a few minutes ago, and was not directed at the captain. "Keep looking. Firework is very naughty, but Firework is smarter than you people think, so don't worry too much about her. Just remember one thing, Firework must go to school in the capital. As for the news of her disappearance this time, strictly prohibit it from being leaked. I don't want those skinny old members of the management committee to make an issue out of this matter and say that our 4th military region is looking for excuses to delay the investigation." "Yes, boss." The captain's heart was really full of shame. The hands by his side clenched tightly, thinking to himself that if he really did find the young miss, he would definitely see who dared to help her and find food for her every day. When the time came, he would definitely tear that person to pieces. Right at this moment, the spaceship's central control computer emitted a cold voice again. "Abnormal power output in Area 38. Abnormal ground stress. Suspected to be an internal impact." At this time, Schuler did not feel like he was being torn to pieces. Although he had always been suspicious of Little Watermelon's background, there was no way he could have connected the little girl to the 4th military region, the Federation, or any other distant upper-class existence. After all, he was just an orphan who had grown up at the bottom of the Federation's hierarchy. Subconsciously, he felt that those things were very far away from him. Moreover, right now, his whole mind was focused on the broken mecha beneath his feet. A faint glow seeped out from the cockpit, and in this glow, Shu Le, who was stepping on the door of the mecha, looked like a figure from a painting. Suddenly discovering the secret hidden in his hands, knowing what he had learned in these 4 years, in this instant, he naturally thought of his teacher, his friend, his boss Feng Yu. The youth could not control the sadness in his heart. He lowered his head and cried silently. His tears dripped onto the surface of the broken mecha, washing away a few traces of dust. Seeing him cry, little Watermelon made a softer sound, and then hurriedly covered her mouth with her 2 small hands. She did not know why big brother Shula was crying. Could it be because he had been able to fix this broken mecha? Could this be what the books called crying tears of joy? It didn't take long for Shula to come back to his senses. He used his sleeves that were full of oil to wipe away the tears on his face, making himself look like a dirty tiger. He looked at the small watermelon on the floor with some embarrassment and said forcefully, "You didn't scare me, right? I won't cry again in the future." He was a man of his word. Since his boss had already left, regardless of whether he was dead or alive, there was no point in trapping himself in these emotions. He would just remember him in his heart, and then live out his life well. From that second onwards, Shula rarely cried until many years later, when he was caught in the rain while walking on the streets. The central control chip of the M02 mecha had long been damaged, and most of its functions had already failed. Shula naturally did not expect to be able to fix the chip in this kind of environment. He had only used some crude and clumsy methods to block the mecha's own alarm system, wanting to test if the transmission performance was good. At this time, since the mecha had already passed the self-check, the excited him naturally wanted to try it out. With some difficulty, he squeezed into the open cockpit, and following the instructions on the manual, he found the control panel without much difficulty. Shula carefully reached his arm into the fixed valve, and his 10 fingers pressed against the simulated surface in a fixed order. Then, to his disappointment, he found that although the transmission system of this mecha seemed to be working, the signal input device was still unable to connect. To be more precise, there was no way to establish a connection between the simulated surface of the control panel and the chipset he had installed. No matter how hard he tried, the entire mecha remained motionless. Left with no other choice, he could only switch to the simulation system, connecting the sensors directly to the surface of his skin. This type of system had basically been phased out by now, because scientists had confirmed through their research that no matter how developed the human body was, the reaction speed shown by using the simulation system would still be very slow. Moreover, this type of control method required too much energy, so no one would be able to use this method to operate a mecha for long periods of time. It was just that in the early days of the constitutional calendar more than 60 years ago, the M02 model had still retained this sort of useless system anyway. He just needed to make the mecha move a little, so Shula did not mind sweating. This was an illusion of skin and muscle tissue. It was very thick and very heavy. Shula's brow furrowed, and he found that perhaps because the mecha had been damaged for too long, there was a problem with the sensor system. His nervous system was directing the movement of his muscles, but there was no way to make this mecha move at all. Suddenly, with a flash of inspiration, or perhaps it was an instinctive reaction, Shula pursed his lips and closed his eyes. His waist instantly began to tremble, and a huge force was transmitted directly from his waist to his arms. Then, with a muffled grunt, he raised both arms. Mirroring his actions, the huge tattered M02 mech slowly raised its arms amidst a series of teeth-numbing screeches. Under the surprised gazes of the 2 children, the mecha took a step forward, and then it collapsed with a loud crash. With a loud crash, the M02 mecha fell to the ground in front of the little girl in white, becoming a pile of metal parts and circuit boards emitting green smoke. Chapter 40. A loud noise came from Area 38 at the back of the commercial spaceship Ancient Clock. After a while, the ashen-faced Shu Le finally crawled out of the pile of metal components and electrical circuit boards. The youth stupidly stepped on a piece of the mecha's front armor and stood there in a daze for a long time. Only then did he remember to use his hands to feel around his body. After confirming that he had not been hit by the heavy mecha fragments and that there were no serious wounds on his body other than some scratches, he finally let out a sigh of relief. In an extremely ancient chronology, 60 years seemed to be a very important period of time. It was called 30 years, and represented an extremely long period of time. This worn-out M02 mecha had been in this junkyard for an unknown period of time, but it had been at least 60 years since it left the factory. The damage it had suffered back then and the natural aging of the metal components had made it easy for it to fall apart. It disintegrated in an instant, but it did not turn into a 2-story building debris and bury Schuler in it. Schuler's face was a little pale. His hands and legs were somewhat uncoordinated as he crawled over the high and low metal components on the ground. The first thing he did was to pull out the charging plug from the wall's current output port. He then walked around the wall in a circle before he finally reached Little Watermelon. He did not even dare to look at the ground. Little Watermelon was also scared out of her wits. Her eyes were wide open as she looked at the empty space. It was as if the mecha that had suddenly collapsed in front of her was still there. Her mouth was wide open, and her expression was extremely cute. That dirty doll also fell from her hands onto the floor. Schuler hugged the little girl in his arms and comforted her. Only then did he manage to coax her back to her senses. Schuler turned around and looked at the mecha fragments on the ground. There were actually quite a few sharp metal sections. His heart was still beating fast as he said in a hoarse voice, "Damn it, this is too weak." A mecha whose main components were all made up of anti-fatigue alloys. Although it had survived for 60 years and suffered fatal damage, it should not have been so weak. Schuler's complaints were clearly not in the right place. Up until now, he still did not know that it was his method of operating his mecha that had caused this dangerous outcome. That strange tremor that had originated from his waist and spread to his limbs had been magnified by sensors to the transmission system of the mecha, and then magnified accordingly, causing the old mecha to be unable to withstand such strong vibrations. Moreover, the young man's repair work over the past few days had damaged the connection strength of the mecha's body a second time, resulting in the shocking scene of the mecha disintegrating in one step earlier. Putting aside the real reason for the mecha's disintegration, when Little Watermelon heard Schuler's strange words, she felt that it was very fresh and very amusing. She giggled, and there was no longer any trace of fear on the little girl's face. Schuler scratched his head and smiled bitterly. He carried the small watermelon and walked towards the air conditioning channel outside the cabin. Although he did not know that the people on the spaceship had decided to search the lower level, he knew that the loud noise from before would definitely alert many people to come and investigate. Crawling through the stuffy darkness of the slender channel, Schuler's hand would occasionally nudge the small watermelon's delicate white shoes. His mood was unusually relaxed, without a trace of regret. That M02 he had repaired with his own hands had only taken the first historic step before disintegrating. He might never be able to enter that abandoned storage pod again, but he had finally gotten close to a mecha for the first time, and had even repaired a mecha with his own hands. Even if it had not been a success, the youth had no plans to become a mecha warrior. To him, this old and broken mecha was just an unusually rare experimental material. Thus, he could only sigh, admitting that it was indeed very foolish of him to dream of repairing an intricate mecha in such a simple and crude environment, using those scraped-together materials from all over the place. These past 4 years, Fengyu's teachings by example had always played a role in areas that Schuler was well aware of. Mecha mechanics had always been dismissive of the mecha worshipped by little boys. They believed that in modern warfare, mecha were such high-energy and low-energy close combat weapons, and were really useless. Just a random group of cannons would be enough to burn these expensive diamonds into black charcoal. Other than those large-scale leaping special forces operations, mecha were just decorations. Although in these past few years, Schuler had never admitted this in front of Uncle Feng, he had subconsciously accepted this concept. Except mecha were really cool. Half a minute after the ceiling panel on the ceiling had been replaced, a flurry of noisy and frantic footsteps arrived at Area 38 behind the spaceship. The sound of cabin doors opening rang out one after another. Finally, The storage compartment that stored the old mecha and even more abandoned metal parts was opened. More than 10 young men wearing light brown officer uniforms hurried in. With one glance, they discovered that the loud noise had come from here, and also discovered the strangeness of this room. The gloomy-faced captain and his personal secretary parted the crowd and walked in. The captain walked to the mecha fragments strewn all over the floor, and with his hands behind his back, swept a few glances over them. Then, he walked to the other side of the crowd, bent down with some difficulty, and picked up the dirty doll on the floor. Miss was here just now. The captain's expression was even more gloomy than before. The secretary glanced at him and lowered his head. He did not blame his superior at this inappropriate time, nor did he pay attention to the abnormal current output alarm of the central control computer just now. The plump captain walked around the mecha fragments with his fat body, picking up a metal plate or a circuit board that was still smoking from time to time. His expression grew heavier and heavier, and without turning his head, he ordered, "The search direction is on the next floor, focus on Area 33 to Area 42. Pull up all the videos from the past few days, see which areas the pipes here lead to, and find the most suspicious ones." The captain looked up at the entrances of the pipes not far away, his brows furrowed tightly, and said, "Separate the stun batons and guns, and use the fastest time to find the miss." The officers in brown uniforms were all exchange students from the Westwoods Military Academy. To be able to represent the first-rate Westwoods Military Academy on a visit to Donglin, they were naturally the best of the best in the academy, and were also the focus of the 4th Military Region's training. After hearing this, they very sensitively sensed the strangeness. Just looking for a 6-year-old girl, did they need to take the risk of equipping the ship with guns? But none of them dared to have the slightest doubt about the captain's orders. They just suppressed their excitement and uneasiness, looked at each other, and walked out of the cabin door to begin preparing for the search. "Why do you need guns?" The secretary walked to the captain's side and asked in a low voice. He knew that the captain must have discovered something very important, otherwise he would not be so nervous. The captain's gaze lowered, staring at the mecha fragments and some strange components on the floor, and said, "This broken mecha has been here for so many years, I've forgotten. That person actually tried to repair it. Mineral star walking car, self-propelled cannon, and even a fucking self-propelled sweeper." The captain's tone was full of anger and mockery, but more than that, it was a feeling of absurdity. He actually wanted to use these things to repair a mecha. If this person dares to have such an idea, then he is either a genius or a madman. Maybe that person is a madman deep down, but this mecha clearly moved and then fell apart. Although he failed, you have to admit that he is a genius. The captain's eyes stared at the secretary like an eagle. "A crazy genius is kidnapping our miss right now. Not to mention guns, even if you want me to connect to the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation right now, I am willing. Although the juniors in the military academy grew up eating shit, I still trust their abilities. I don't think they are stupid enough to shoot around without looking at the environment." The captain's eyes gradually became anxious. "I'm just thinking, who is the person who can kidnap the miss right under our noses? Is it a spy from the Empire, or someone from the anti-government army? The anti-government army has been disbanded for many years. They have been non-violent and non-cooperative all these years, so it shouldn't be them." The secretary was worried, but still eliminated the target. The captain said sternly, "Have you been brainwashed by those people? How could someone from the Empire get on our Westwoods ship? How would those refugees from Bermuda dare to enter the territory of the Federation? Other than the anti-government army, who else would keep provoking the relationship between the 4th Military Region and the Federation?" It turned out that the fat captain's worrisome judgment was a misunderstanding or a mistake. A person's vision always had blind spots, and a search job would also have blind spots. That was why the people on the ancient clock couldn't find the little girl for so many days. Once they readjusted the correct direction, with the help of the powerful computer, it only took the staff 3 minutes to find the suspicious point in the video. A picture taken through the surveillance camera was enlarged and sent to the captain. In the picture, a little girl in white pajamas was standing quietly beside a young man, quietly looking at the beautiful scenery of the stars outside the large porthole. This was the day before we left the Eastwoods region, and also the day the miss went missing. The captain's expression eased a little because in the video, the staff did not find any trace of the miss being held hostage. Find this young man, find the miss. Soon, all kinds of information were sent back. Once the target was confirmed, the ancient clock, which had a strong military background in the Westwoods, responded quickly. It really had the style of a field army. At that time, Shula and Little Watermelon had just taken a shower in the room. He was wrapping the little girl's shaking head with a snow-white towel and preparing to dry her hair. Suddenly, he found that the door of the room was silently opened. More than a dozen black and extremely cold muzzles were pointed at his head. Chapter 41. As the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team was all injured, the soldiers in charge of the search on the ancient bell were all from the Westwoods Military Academy. These young officers under the age of 20 were the cream of the crop. Every one of them had excellent abilities and results, which was why they were arranged to visit the Eastwoods region. Today, every one of them had the ability to enter the 4th Military Region's Elite Special Forces Brigade. In the future, they were destined to bathe in the flames of war on the border between the Federation and the Empire. They would continue to advance. The environment around them and the process of their growth gave them a sense of pride in their bones. However, in these few days, they couldn't find the young miss. The severe sense of failure made them feel extremely depressed, and their pride turned into irritation. Among these Westwoods Military Academy officers, Ju Jin was recognized as the leader. This was because he was the strongest individual and had the strongest leadership skills. This included this moment, where he was the one who planned the surprise attack to rescue the young miss. Ju Jin was 20 years old this year. He was handsome, and his youthful face carried a strong military aura. He looked at the young man under his gun and frowned slightly. The other party shouldn't be a professional. Otherwise, it was impossible that he didn't notice the surprise attack. But why was this person still so calm under so many guns? Was it this young man who kidnapped the young miss and hid her for so many days under his search? A trace of doubt flashed through Ju Jin's heart, but he didn't hesitate to grab the young miss in the other party's arms with a crisp slap. Ju Jin's heart sank. He felt a sharp pain in his wrist and his hand grabbed nothing. He frowned again, thinking that this person's grappling technique was very strange. He couldn't see how the other party stretched out his hand. Shula sat on the edge of the bed and raised his arm to block the soldier's outstretched hand. With his right hand, he shielded Little Watermelon behind him. He stared at the other party warily and asked, "Who are you?" Shula's calmness surprised Ju Jin, because not everyone could remain calm while being aimed at by so many guns. That was because this military academy student did not know that just over a month ago, Shula had already experienced such a situation. Moreover, in order to protect the little girl beside him, he had to remain calm. One of his hands held Little Watermelon behind him, protecting her tightly. His fingers clamped a corner of the snow-white towel, so that the towel was still placed on Little Watermelon's head, so that she wouldn't be scared when she saw the cold muzzles. Shula raised a question, but no one answered it. Because in the eyes of this group of proud officers, this young man was a criminal who had kidnapped the young miss. He was the target of their incomparable hatred. Who would chat with a criminal? Moreover, the young miss was still in his hands. A burly officer rushed forward and struck Shula hard in the neck with his elbow. For the sake of the young miss's safety, of course they did not dare to shoot recklessly in such a small space. The safest choice was to knock the criminal out or knock him down at the first moment. Seeing this powerful elbow strike the target's neck directly, the officers from the Westwoods Military Academy simultaneously breathed a sigh of relief in their hearts. Even the always cautious Ju Jin's expression relaxed slightly. He lowered his gun slightly and took a step forward, preparing to cut off the young miss from the criminal before he fell to the ground. In the eyes of these proud Westwoods people, anyone who took a direct hit from Wang Meng's elbow on the back of the head could only end up fainting and falling to the ground. However, what none of them expected was that Ju Jin's hand missed again. The young criminal did not fall, but instead shrunk back and protected the little girl, who was still covered in the white towel, to the furthest corner of the room, beside the window. Ju Jin's eyes narrowed. Shula cautiously put down his palms that were on the side of his neck. The edges of his palms were slightly red. Just a moment ago, facing the whistling elbow, he subconsciously moved according to the set of movements that the uncle had taught him. His body's natural reaction allowed his palms to enter the area faster than the opponent, and the palm that passed through his armpit cleverly neutralized the huge force. However, the current situation did not change at all. With so many guns aimed at him, Shula did not dare to make any sudden movements, nor did he dare to try to break out of the encirclement. He could only carefully protect little Watermelon behind him. He felt that this situation was a little strange, and tried to explain something. If the other party was really one of those bad guys little Watermelon had described, then what to do was something that needed to be considered later. However, the officers from the Westwoods Military Academy, who were already in a frenzy, did not give Shula any chance to explain. In the shortest amount of time possible, they confirmed that Shula did not carry any weapons. Following Ju Jin's dark and angry voice, 4 military academy students pounced at the same time. Under the suppression of the guns, Shula was knocked to the ground. Earlier, he had clearly heard the words of the soldier who seemed to be the leader, and did not dare to take the risk. Countless fists landed on his body at the same time. The immense pain made his body curl up. Little Watermelon, who was covered in a white towel, was also snatched away by the other military academy students at the first instance and distanced herself from him. Right at this moment, a cold voice came from outside the room. Beat him up for interrogation first. Beat him until even his mother can't recognize him. The fat captain walked in with a gloomy expression. Seeing the figure of the little girl safely protected by the military academy students, he breathed a sigh of relief. He anxiously went to the little girl's side to confirm that she had not suffered any injuries. "Don't hit Big Brother." Little Watermelon's shrill voice rang out through the white towel. Her crisp childish voice was particularly piercing due to her anger. She immediately lifted the white towel on her head and glared angrily at the soldiers who had pinned Shula to the floor. The room suddenly became quiet. The white towel was flipped up in the air, revealing the little girl's tender face and her swaying black hair. "Miss." "Ah." The fat captain picked up the little girl and prepared to take her away from this place, lest the little girl's clean eyes be sullied by the interrogation later. He did not expect that after the little Watermelon was held in his arms, she would suddenly struggle. She screamed and scratched everywhere with her 2 hands. She was as violent as a little tiger. She scratched the fat captain's face until there were streaks of blood. She screamed out loud, "Let go of Big Brother. Name." After a slight hesitation, Shula, who was sitting by the bed, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and replied, "Shula." "Place of origin?" "Work." "You're actually a retired soldier." The fat captain raised his wrist and waited for the contents of the information confirmation. He looked up, looked at Shula and said, "According to the Federation's regulations on spaceship management, I have the right to exercise limited law enforcement authority on this spaceship. I will arrest you for kidnapping a child." The crime of kidnapping a child was a felony in the Federation. It was punishable by more than 7 years of imprisonment, up to the death penalty. Shula licked the crack on his lips, looked up and stared at the fat captain. Looking at the blood on his face, he said mockingly, "I want to see your work permit. I also want to see the management power of the little Watermelon. Zhong Huiyen's parents. I'm a retired soldier. I don't have any law enforcement authority, but I have reason to suspect that you tried to kidnap a girl. Unless you kill me, I will report you to the police after we get off the ship." The captain looked at Shula as if he was looking at a monster. After a long silence, he suddenly laughed. "Are you joking?" "I'm not joking. If you can't produce her family's management power of attorney, I have the right to suspect you." Shula felt a little sweetness on his tongue. Only then did he realize how ruthless the soldiers were. "Okay, I can give you all of this, but how do you explain your behavior for so many days? Even if you accidentally ran into the little miss, don't you know that this kind of thing should be left to the staff to deal with, and not you hiding her yourself?" The fat captain interlaced his fingers and said slowly. In fact, while his heart was relaxed, he also felt that this matter was too absurd. After the little Watermelon's desperate resistance, The people in the field finally understood what happened after the little miss disappeared. The people in the Westwoods naturally understood that the young man, who they initially regarded as a spy against the government or a criminal who kidnapped a child, was actually just a pitiful person who had suffered an undeserved disaster. For some unspeakable reason, the captain did not intend to let Shula go just like that. He still looked at the young man coldly and kept putting pressure on him. However, Shula did not seem to feel the pressure and said calmly, "The little miss said that there are bad people in her family who want to take her away from her hometown and never let her see her parents again." At this time, the management power of attorney was finally faxed to the ancient belle from the distant Westwoods. At the same time, the spaceship also confirmed the identity of the chip behind Shula's neck. The captain handed 2 pieces of paper to Shula and said mockingly, "You're not young anymore. How can you be so naive to believe the words of a little girl who ran away from home?" Shula flipped a few pages and thought of the suspicious points that the little watermelon showed during this period. He knew that the fat captain was not lying. The little watermelon's family did want to send her to school in the capital ring, and the little watermelon might have misunderstood something. After hearing the captain's mocking words, Shula did not raise his head and said directly, "Why can't I believe her? I've always been willing to believe in people and help them, even if she's only 6 years old. So you're a hothead with a strong sense of justice." The captain was slightly stunned and stood up to mock him. Shula raised his head, stared at his face, and said seriously, "Isn't it better to have a strong sense of justice? Even if it's overflowing, isn't it a good thing?" The captain was speechless and looked seriously at Shula's sincere and honest face. It seemed that he wanted to distinguish whether such a person really existed in this world. After the captain left, the room became quiet again. Shula, who was under house arrest in the room, looked at the gun barrel on his forehead and said to the young soldiers, "Can you put away the gun? I'm not a criminal, and I hate having a gun pointed at my head the most." A trace of disdain flashed across the faces of the officers. These people originally wanted to make him suffer a little. At this time, when they heard Shula's words, they used their ice-cold gun barrels to poke his temples. Shula felt a burst of pain, and he couldn't help but raise his head to look at the other party. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.